Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Mount Elbert in Colorado, deep in the Sawatch Range where cell towers don't reach, and the nearest road is a 20-mile hike through terrain that can kill you if you're not careful. I should have listened to Sarah when she said we shouldn't go. My wife has always had better instincts than me, but I was so focused on proving something to myself, and maybe to her, that I ignored every red flag. The marriage counselor had suggested we try something adventurous together, something to break the monotony that had been slowly strangling our relationship for the past 2 years. What better adventure than a week-long backpacking trip through some of Colorado's most pristine wilderness? The plan was simple. Park at the Twin Lakes trailhead, hike up to the high country near Mount Elbert, and spend 5 days exploring the backcountry before circling back. I'd done plenty of research, studied the topographic maps until I could navigate them blindfolded, and packed enough gear for any reasonable emergency. What I hadn't accounted for was the unreasonable. Sarah had been quiet during the drive up from Denver, staring out the passenger window at the increasingly wild landscape. The aspen trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves catching the late September light like scattered coins. Beautiful, but there was something else in her expression, a tightness around her eyes that I recognized but chose to ignore. "You sure about this, Mike?" she asked as I pulled into the gravel parking area. There were only 2 other vehicles there, both covered in dust and looking like they'd been abandoned for days. "Come on, babe. When's the last time we did something like this together?" I hefted my pack, testing the weight distribution. 45 pounds, perfectly balanced. "Remember when we used to camp all the time? Before the house, before the miscarriage." I didn't say it, but we both heard it anyway. Sarah's face went carefully blank, the way it always did when that particular wound got poked. "That was car camping, Mike. This is different." "Different? How? We're both in good shape. I've planned everything down to the last detail." I pulled out the GPS unit, showing her our route marked in red. "Look, it's only about 8 miles to our first campsite. Easy day." She shouldered her pack without another word, but I caught her looking back at the car like she was memorizing it, like she thought she might not see it again. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was well maintained, winding through dense forests of spruce and fir that smelled like Christmas morning. We crossed several creeks on sturdy wooden bridges, the sound of rushing water accompanying our steady footsteps. Sarah's mood seemed to improve as we gained elevation, and by the time we stopped for lunch, she was actually smiling. "Okay, I admit it," she said, unwrapping an energy bar. "This is pretty amazing." The view from our lunch spot was spectacular. Rolling peaks stretching to the horizon, their summits already dusted with early snow. Below us, the valley spread out like a green carpet, unmarked by roads or buildings. It was the kind of vista that made you feel small in the best possible way. "See? What did I tell you?" I squeezed her hand, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. We needed this. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't the normal quiet of the wilderness, which is never really quiet at all. There should have been bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through the trees. Instead, there was an absence so complete it felt like someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. Sarah noticed it too. "Where are all the birds?" I looked around, suddenly aware that we hadn't seen so much as a squirrel in the past hour. The forest felt empty, watching us with thousands of unseen eyes. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the altitude. "Probably just the time of day," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "We should keep moving. Want to reach camp before dark." The afternoon hiking was harder than I'd anticipated. The trail grew steeper and less distinct, forcing us to check our GPS frequently. Sarah, who had been keeping up easily, began to lag behind. Every few minutes, she'd stop and look back down the trail, as if expecting to see something following us. "You okay?" I asked during one of these pauses. "Just, don't you feel like we're being watched?" I did, but admitting it would only make things worse. "It's just the trees. Lots of shadows up here." But as the day wore on, that feeling of being observed grew stronger. It wasn't paranoia. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know the difference between normal alertness and genuine unease. This was something else. A primitive warning system that every cell in my body was screaming to heed. By the time we reached our planned campsite, a small clearing beside an alpine lake called Mir Tarn, the sun was already setting behind the peaks. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and our breath came out in visible puffs as we hurriedly set up camp. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the last light of day like polished obsidian. Beautiful, but there was something unsettling about its absolute stillness. No ripples from fish jumping, no water birds disturbing the surface. Just that same unnatural quiet that had been following us all afternoon. I was wrestling with our tent stakes when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Mike, look at the water." I followed her gaze to the lake's edge where our reflection should have been visible in the dying light. And it was, sort of. There were two figures kneeling by the water, but something was wrong with the image. The reflections were too dark, too indistinct, and they seemed to be moving independently of our actual movements. "It's just the light," I said, but my voice came out hoarse. "Low angle makes everything look weird." Sarah stepped back from the water's edge. "Those reflections, they're not matching what we're doing." She was right. While we stood still, the dark figures in the water appeared to be gesturing to each other, their movements fluid and deliberate. I blinked hard, certain it was a trick of tired eyes and fading light, but when I looked again, the reflections were still wrong. "We need to finish setting up camp," I said, turning away from the lake. "Getting dark fast up here." But when I tried to drive the next tent stake into the ground, the hammer bounced off like I was hitting solid rock. I tried a different spot with the same result. The earth that should have been soft mountain soil felt like concrete beneath a thin layer of leaves and pine needles. "That's weird," I muttered, moving to another location. Same result. It was as if the ground itself was rejecting our presence. Sarah was watching me struggle with the stakes, her face pale in the dying light. "Mike, maybe we should—" "Got it." I'd finally found a spot where the stakes would penetrate, about 10 feet from where I'd originally planned to put the tent. It wasn't ideal. The ground was slightly sloped and too close to a stand of dead trees, but it would have to do. As I worked, I became aware of a new sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Not quite mechanical, not quite organic, but persistent and unsettling. I paused in my work, listening carefully. "You hear that?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "What is it?" The humming grew slightly louder, joined by what sounded like whispers just at the edge of audibility, words in a language I didn't recognize, spoken by voices that didn't sound entirely human. I forced myself to keep working, driving the stakes with more force than necessary. Probably just wind through the rocks. Sound carries weird up here. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so still that the flame of our camp stove burned straight up without flickering. The whispering continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. By the time we had camp set up and dinner started, full darkness had fallen like a curtain. Our headlamps created a small bubble of light that only made the surrounding wilderness feel more vast and threatening. The humming had stopped, but the whispers continued, sometimes close enough that I found myself turning to see who was speaking. "I don't like this place," Sarah said quietly, stirring our freeze-dried beef stroganoff. "Something's wrong here." I wanted to disagree, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, but the wrongness was undeniable now. The silence was too complete, the darkness too absolute. Even with my headlamp on its brightest setting, the light seemed to be absorbed by the blackness rather than penetrating it. "We'll be fine," I said, though I was already planning our exit strategy. "First light tomorrow, we'll pack up and head back down. Promise?" "Promise." That was a lie, and we both knew it. I had too much invested in this trip to give up after one night. The marriage counselor's words echoed in my head. Sometimes you need to push through discomfort to reach something better on the other side. We ate in relative silence. The only sounds are chewing and the occasional whisper from the darkness beyond our camp. The food tasted like cardboard, though I couldn't tell if that was the freeze-dried meal or my own anxiety killing my appetite. "I'm going to brush my teeth," Sarah announced, standing up with her toiletry bag. "I'll come with you." "I can walk 10 feet to the lake by myself, Mike." But as she moved toward the water's edge, her headlamp beam dancing across the ground, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The beam wasn't casting shadows where it should have. Tree branches, rocks, even our own gear. Nothing was creating the normal interplay of light and shadow that you'd expect. "Sarah, wait." She had reached the water's edge and was kneeling down to fill her water bottle when she screamed. Not a normal scream of surprise or fear, but something primal and raw that seemed to tear itself from her throat. She lurched backward, dropping her water bottle and scrambling away from the lake on her hands and knees. I ran to her, my headlamp beam sweeping frantically across the water's surface. For just a moment, I thought I saw them. Dark shapes beneath the surface, too large and too numerous to be fish. They moved with intelligence, with purpose, rising toward the surface before sinking back into the depths. "What did you see?" I helped Sarah to her feet, feeling her entire body trembling against mine. "Faces," she whispered. "Faces in the water, looking up at me. And they were smiling." I aimed my light at the lake again, but the surface was mirror smooth, reflecting nothing but our headlamp beams. Whatever Sarah had seen, whatever we'd both seen, was gone. "We're leaving," I said, making a decision that felt like the first rational thought I'd had all day. "Right now. We'll pack up and hike out by headlamp. It's too dark, too dangerous." She was right, of course. The trail back down was treacherous enough in daylight with loose rocks and steep drop-offs. At night, with nothing but headlamps to guide us, we'd be more likely to walk off a cliff than make it back to the car. "Okay, but first thing tomorrow, we're out of here." We retreated to our tent, zipping the fly shut like it could protect us from whatever was out there. Sarah's sleeping bag was pressed against mine, her breathing quick and shallow. Every few minutes one of us would hear something. A footstep, a whisper, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, and we'd freeze, listening intently until the sound faded, or we convinced ourselves we'd imagined it. I must have dozed off around midnight because I woke to the sound of our tent zipper being slowly opened from the outside. The noise was deliberate, careful, as if someone was trying not to wake us. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to the zipper's teeth separating one by one. Sarah was pressed against my back, her breathing so shallow I could barely feel it. The zipper reached the bottom of the door, and cold air rushed into the tent. Through the now open flap, I could see nothing but absolute darkness. No stars, no moon, nothing but a void that seemed to swallow our headlamp beams. Then I heard Sarah's voice from outside the tent. "Mike? Mike, are you awake? I need help." But Sarah was right there beside me, rigid with terror. The voice outside was hers exactly. Same cadence, same slight rasp she got when she was tired, but Sarah was in the tent with me. "Mike," the voice came again, patient and insistent. "I'm hurt. Please come help me." Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, her grip so tight it was painful. We lay there listening to the thing outside our tent, using my wife's voice to try to lure me out into the darkness. "I'm scared, Mike. I can't find the tent. Please help me." The voice was moving now, circling our camp. Sometimes it came from the direction of the lake, sometimes from the tree line. sometimes from directly overhead as if the speaker was floating in the air above us. "Mike, why won't you answer me? I'm so cold." The pleading tone was perfect, exactly how Sarah sounded when she was truly frightened. If I hadn't been able to feel her trembling beside me, I might have been fooled. We lay there for what felt like hours, listening to that thing use Sarah's voice to call to me from the darkness. Sometimes it would be patient and sad, sometimes angry and accusatory. Once it began to sob with such convincing despair that I almost broke, almost unzipped the tent to go to it. Then, just before dawn, the voice changed. "Michael Williams," it said, and now it was my voice calling out, perfect down to the slight Boston accent I'd never quite lost. "Sarah needs you. She's in the water. She's drowning." Beside me, Sarah's breathing hitched. The thing outside was using my voice now, pleading with her the same way it had pleaded with me. "Sarah, please. I can't swim. I can't reach her. You have to help me save her." The desperation in the voice was heartbreaking, and I felt Sarah start to move, her body instinctively responding to what sounded like her husband in mortal distress. "Don't," I whispered, gripping her hand tighter. "It's not me." But the voice outside was relentless, cycling between my voice and hers, creating elaborate scenarios designed to get us to leave the tent. Sometimes I was drowning. Sometimes she was hurt. Sometimes we were both calling for help from different directions simultaneously. The psychological assault continued until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the tent fabric. Only then did the voices stop, leaving us alone with the sound of our own ragged breathing. "We need to go," Sarah whispered. "Right now." I couldn't agree more. We dressed quickly, not bothering with breakfast or even coffee. The only thing that mattered was getting away from Mir Tarn and whatever lived in its depths. But when I opened the tent flap and stepped outside, I immediately knew our problems were far from over. Our campsite looked different in the morning light. The fire ring we'd used the night before was gone, replaced by a circle of blackened stones that looked ancient and weathered. Our food hang, which I'd secured 20 feet up in a nearby tree, was on the ground beside the tent, the rope neatly coiled as if it had been carefully lowered rather than torn down. Most disturbing of all, there were footprints in the soft earth around our tent. Lots of them, made by bare feet that were too long and too narrow to be human. They circled our camp in concentric rings, some overlapping, as if a crowd of things had spent the night walking around us. "Jesus," I breathed, following the trail of prints to the lake's edge. There, the footprints disappeared into the water, but the mud at the shoreline was churned up as if something large had recently emerged from the depths. Sarah was packing frantically, stuffing her sleeping bag into its compression sack without bothering to roll it properly. "We need to go. Now." I wanted to argue, to suggest we investigate further, but one look at the panic in her eyes killed that impulse. Whatever was happening here was beyond our ability to handle or understand. We broke camp in record time, shouldering our packs and starting down the trail as the sun crested the eastern peaks. I kept looking back at Mir Tarn, half expecting to see something emerging from its dark waters, but the lake remained perfectly still. The trail down should have been easier than the climb up, but within an hour I realized we had a new problem. The path we were following didn't match my memory of the route we'd taken the day before. The landmarks were wrong. Rock formations I should have remembered, creek crossings that weren't on my map, switchbacks that curved in directions that made no sense. "Are you sure this is the right trail?" Sarah asked, voicing my own growing concern. I pulled out my GPS unit, waiting for it to acquire satellites. When it finally got a lock, the screen showed our position as a blinking dot in the middle of what should have been solid wilderness, miles from any known trail. "That can't be right," I muttered, turning the unit off and back on. Same result. According to the GPS, we were in a valley that didn't exist on any map, following a trail that led nowhere. "Mike, look at this." Sarah was kneeling beside the trail, examining something in the dirt. I joined her and felt my stomach drop. There, pressed into the mud, was a perfect impression of a boot sole. My boot sole, judging by the distinctive tread pattern. But the print was facing the wrong direction. Instead of pointing downhill toward where we'd come from, it pointed uphill toward Mirror Tarn. "When did you walk this way?" Sarah asked. "I didn't. This print is pointing up the trail, but we've been walking down all morning." She stood up slowly, scanning the forest around us. "Mike, there are more of them." She was right. The trail was covered with boot prints, all facing uphill, all made by boots that matched ours exactly. It was as if we'd walked this section of trail multiple times, always heading toward Mirror Tarn, never away from it. "This is impossible," I said, but even as I spoke I was starting to understand what was happening. We weren't really leaving. Something was making us walk in circles, always returning to the same places, while creating the illusion that we were making progress. The realization hit me like a physical blow. How many times had we broken camp this morning? How many times had we started down this trail, only to end up back at the lake? The footprints suggested we'd been walking for hours, maybe days, trapped in some kind of loop that reset our memories each time. "Sarah," I said quietly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Look at your hands." She held them up, and we both stared in horror. Her palms were covered with blisters, raw and weeping as if she'd been gripping hiking poles for days. My own hands, when I examined them, were in similar condition. Our boots were more worn than they should have been after just one day of hiking, and our clothes were filthy with sweat and grime. "How long have we been here?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, we heard voices coming from up the trail. Human voices, casual and relaxed, discussing the weather and trail conditions. For a moment, my heart leaped with relief. Other hikers, people who could help us get out of whatever was happening. But as the voices grew closer, I recognized them. They were our own voices, from yesterday, having the same conversation we'd had about the beautiful aspen trees and the clear mountain air. Around the bend came two figures, a man and a woman in hiking gear, backpacks loaded with camping equipment. They looked exactly like us, but younger somehow, their faces bright with excitement and anticipation instead of worn down by terror and exhaustion. The other, Sarah, was laughing at something the other Mike had said. The sound carried clearly on the thin mountain air. They looked happy, hopeful, completely unaware of what waited for them at Mirror Tarn. "We have to warn them," Sarah said, starting toward the approaching figures. But as she moved, the other versions of ourselves began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Only their voices remained echoing through the forest as they discussed their plans for the perfect wilderness camping trip. "It's yesterday," I said, the truth hitting me like a sledgehammer. "We're seeing yesterday, when we first started up the trail." The voices faded, leaving us alone in the forest that seemed to shift and change around us. Trees appeared and disappeared, the trail branched and merged and vanished entirely, and through it all, we kept walking, driven by some compulsion we couldn't understand or resist. Time became meaningless. We'd hike for what felt like hours, only to find ourselves back at familiar landmarks. We'd rest, we'd eat, we'd sleep, and then we'd wake up hiking again, sometimes in daylight, sometimes in darkness, always moving but never arriving anywhere. Sarah began to change first. It was subtle at the beginning, longer pauses when I spoke to her, a tendency to stare at nothing for minutes at a time. But as the days, weeks, months passed, the changes became more pronounced. She stopped talking entirely, communicating only through nods and gestures. Her movements became mechanical, repetitive, like she was following a script written by someone else. Most disturbing of all, she began to smile at inappropriate times. When we encountered dead animals on the trail, when we found disturbing symbols carved into tree bark, when the whispers started up again at night. "Sarah," I said one evening as we made camp in a clearing I didn't recognize but felt like I'd seen 1,000 times before. "Talk to me, please." She looked at me with eyes that held no recognition, her face blank as a mannequin's. When she smiled, her lips pulled back too far, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should have been. "Sarah's not here anymore," she said in a voice that was hers but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Sarah went into the water. I came out instead." That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing that looked like my wife, afraid of what it might do if I let my guard down. It sat motionless by the cold fire pit, staring at me with that terrible empty smile, occasionally making small clicking sounds with its tongue that no human throat should have been able to produce. When dawn came, it stood up and shouldered its pack with mechanical precision. "Time to go," it said in Sarah's voice. "Mirror Tarn is waiting." I followed because I had no choice. The forest wouldn't let me go in any other direction, and being alone with the thing that wore my wife's face was somehow worse than the alternative. At least while we were moving, it mostly looked and acted like Sarah. It was only when we stopped that the mask slipped, revealing the predator underneath. The trail took us through landscapes that defied physics, impossible vistas where mountains folded in on themselves, valleys that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, forests where the trees grew downward into the sky. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of other hikers trapped in their own loops, walking the same paths over and over, their faces vacant and their movements puppet-like. "How long?" I asked the thing that had been Sarah during one of our rest stops. "Time doesn't work the same here," it replied, examining its fingernails with clinical interest. "Some have been walking for decades, some for centuries. You're new, though, still fighting it." "Fighting what?" "The integration, the becoming. Eventually you'll stop resisting, and then you'll be one of us. It's easier that way, less painful." I looked around at the twisted landscape, at the other trapped hikers visible in the distance, at the thing that had taken my wife's form. "What are you?" It smiled that terrible smile. "Old, hungry, patient. We've been here since before your kind learned to walk upright. This place, it's a trap, but also a feeding ground. We consume experiences, memories, the essential essence of what makes you human. In return, we give you eternity. A fair trade, don't you think? Where's Sarah, the real Sarah? Gone, dissolved, integrated. She's part of us now, which is why I can wear her shape so perfectly. Every thought she ever had, every memory, every emotion, it's all here, inside us." The thing leaned closer, and I could smell something rotten on its breath, like meat left too long in the sun. "Would you like to join her? The process is intense, but brief, and then you'll never be alone again. Never feel pain or loss or regret. Isn't that what you wanted when you came here? To escape your problems? To find peace?" It was right, of course. The marriage counselor, the grief over our lost child, the growing distance between Sarah and me, we'd come here to escape all of that. And now we'd found something that promised to make all the pain go away forever. "No," I said, forcing myself to meet its eyes. "I want my wife back." The thing that looked like Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She never existed. None of this exists. You've been walking in circles for so long you've forgotten what's real and what isn't. Look at your hands, Michael. Really, look at them." I held up my hands and gasped. They were translucent, like smoke given form. I could see the forest through my palms, the ground through my feet. I was fading, becoming part of the illusion. "You see? You're already one of us. You have been for a long time. The Michael Williams who drove up from Denver doesn't exist anymore. You're just an echo, a memory of a memory, playing out the same story over and over again." But even as it spoke, I felt something inside me rebel against the words. There was still a part of me that remembered driving up the mountain road, remembered Sarah's nervous laughter as we'd loaded our packs, remembered the taste of the energy bar I'd eaten at lunch. Those memories felt real in a way that nothing else in this nightmare landscape did. "You're lying," I said. The thing's smile faltered for just a moment. "Am I?" Look around you, Michael. Does any of this make sense? The impossible geography, the time loops, the fact that you haven't eaten or slept or felt truly tired in. How long has it been? Days? Weeks? Years? I couldn't answer because I didn't know. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to measure. But there was still something solid at my core, something that refused to be dissolved. I remember the car, I said. I remember loading the gear, checking the oil, filling up the gas tank in Leadville. False memories, constructs. We've been feeding them to you to keep you walking, to keep you entertaining. I remember Sarah crying in the bathroom after the doctor's appointment. I remember holding her while she sobbed, and how helpless I felt because I couldn't fix it. The thing wearing Sarah's face recoiled slightly, as if the memory caused it pain. I remember the silence in our house afterward, how we'd pass each other in the hallways like ghosts, how she'd flinch when I tried to touch her, and how I'd lie awake at night wondering if we'd ever find our way back to each other. "Stop," the thing hissed. I remember deciding to plan this trip, looking at maps, reading reviews, buying new gear. I remember Sarah's face when I suggested it, hope and fear all mixed together. I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, we could save our marriage if we could just get away from everything that reminded us of what we'd lost. The thing was backing away from me now, its face contorting with something that might have been rage or might have been fear. "Those memories are real," I continued, standing up and following it. "And if they're real, then Sarah is real. And if Sarah is real, then I'm real too." "You don't understand," the thing said, and now its voice was changing, becoming something inhuman and multi-layered. "We've been feeding on you for so long that there's nothing left. You're just echoes now, patterns of thought and memory with no substance behind them. Then why are you afraid of me?" It had no answer for that, but I could see the truth in its ever-changing features. It needed me to believe the lie, needed me to accept that nothing was real, because belief was what gave it power. As long as I remembered who I was, as long as I held on to the truth of my existence, I had something it couldn't take. The landscape around us began to shift and blur, like a movie set being torn down. The impossible mountains dissolved, the twisted forests faded, and suddenly we were standing on familiar ground, the shores of Mirror Tarn, exactly as they had been that first night. But now I could see the lake for what it really was. Not water, but a pit filled with something dark and viscous that moved with predatory intelligence. The things Sarah had seen weren't faces. They were the partially dissolved remains of other hikers, other campers, other people who had been lured here over the decades and centuries. The thing wearing Sarah's face began to change, its borrowed form melting away to reveal something that had never been human. It was tall and thin, with too many joints in its limbs and skin that looked like wet leather. Its face was a shifting mass of features stolen from its victims. Eyes that belonged to a dozen different people, mouths that formed words in voices it had consumed. "You cannot leave," it said in a chorus of stolen voices. "No one leaves. This is the way it has always been." "Maybe," I said, backing toward what I hoped was the trail. "But I'm going to try." The creature lunged at me with impossible speed, its stolen limbs stretching and contorting as it tried to grab me. I dodged, stumbling over the uneven ground, and ran toward the tree line. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, its feet slapping against the ground in a rhythm that was almost but not quite human. Other sounds joined it, howls and screams and whispers, all the voices of everyone it had ever consumed, all crying out for me to stop, to accept my fate, to join them in their eternal walking. I ran through forest that flickered between reality and nightmare, following a trail that appeared and disappeared with each step. Sometimes I was running through familiar Colorado wilderness, sometimes through alien landscapes that hurt to look at directly. The only constant was the creature behind me, gaining ground with each stride. Then, just as I felt its breath on my neck, I saw something that made my heart leap with hope. Tire tracks in the mud, leading to where our car should have been parked. The parking area was empty, but the tire tracks were real, still visible in the dirt. I followed them to where they met the main road, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could see actual civilization in the distance. Telephone poles, power lines, the faint glow of streetlights from some distant town. The creature had stopped at the edge of the parking area, unable or unwilling to venture onto the road. It stood there in the growing daylight, its stolen features shifting and changing as it watched me. "She's still here," it called out, using Sarah's voice one last time. "Part of her will always be here, and part of you too, now. You'll never be free of us completely." I wanted to go back, to demand that it return my wife, to fight it until either it died or I did. But I could feel the truth of its words. Something had been taken from me in that place, something I'd never get back. And Sarah was gone. Whatever that thing was, whatever it had done to her, the woman I'd married was not coming home. I walked down the mountain road until I reached a gas station, where the attendant took one look at me and called the sheriff. I must have been a sight, filthy, exhausted, half mad with what I'd experienced. They found our car still parked at the trailhead, covered with weeks' worth of dust and bird droppings. The search and rescue teams found our campsite at Muir Tarn, but it was empty. No sign of Sarah, no trace of our gear, nothing but a circle of blackened stones and the lingering smell of something rotten. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accident. I know better. I know she's still there in that place between reality and nightmare, walking trails that lead nowhere, integrated into something that should never have existed. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear her calling my name from somewhere very far away. The marriage counselor was right about one thing. We did find something different on that mountain. We found a truth about ourselves, about our relationship, about the price of trying to escape from grief instead of working through it. But some truths are too terrible to live with. Some prices are too high to pay. And some places should never be visited at all. I've never gone camping again. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Mount Elbert, Colorado, during what was supposed to be a healing retreat for me and my 3 closest friends from work. The morning we set out from Leadville, the October air carried that crisp bite that promised snow within days. Sarah Rodriguez, our group's eternal optimist and HR coordinator, had organized this camping trip as a way for us to decompress after the brutal quarter we'd endured at the consulting firm. Michelle Young, our data analyst with the nervous laugh, kept checking her phone every few minutes until we lost signal somewhere past Twin Lakes. Amanda Wright, the toughest of us all, a former Marine turned project manager, just grinned and told Michelle to embrace the digital detox. I needed this more than any of them knew. The nightmares had been getting worse since the divorce, and my therapist suggested that reconnecting with nature might help process the trauma of finding my ex-husband with my sister. What she didn't know was that I'd been hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing shadows move in my peripheral vision. I hoped the wilderness would either cure me or drive me completely insane. At least then I'd know which direction my sanity was heading. We parked at the Half Moon Campground trailhead, planning to hike deeper into the Sawatch Range to a remote camping spot Amanda had researched, a clearing near Emerald Lake that promised solitude and stunning views. The ranger station was closed for the season, which should have been our first warning. A handwritten sign warned of early snowfall and advised against backcountry camping, but Amanda laughed it off. "Come on, ladies, we're not tourists. We've all done this before." The hike started normally. Sarah chatted about her new boyfriend while Michelle documented everything with her camera. Amanda led with military precision, consulting her GPS and topographic map every half mile. I walked in the rear, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dense stands of aspen and pine. 3 hours in, Michelle's camera died. "That's weird," she said, checking the battery indicator. "It was fully charged this morning." "Electronics are finicky at altitude," Amanda said, but I caught the slight frown creasing her forehead. 20 minutes later, Amanda stopped abruptly. "GPS is acting up. Says we're in the middle of a lake." We gathered around her device. The screen flickered between different locations, sometimes showing us miles from where we'd started, sometimes placing us in impossible terrain. Sarah pulled out her phone, but it showed no signal and a battery at 15% despite being at 90% when we'd lost cell service. "Equipment failure happens," Amanda said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "We stick to the trail markers." Except the trail markers started contradicting each other. A wooden sign pointed left toward Emerald Lake, 2 miles. 50 yards later, an identical sign pointed right, claiming the same destination and distance. When Michelle backtracked to photograph the inconsistency, the first sign was gone. Not fallen or damaged, simply absent, as if it had never existed. "You guys are messing with me," Michelle said, but her nervous laugh had a hysterical edge. None of us were laughing. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the past hour, and the wind carried sounds that didn't belong in any forest I knew, a rhythmic scratching like fingernails on bark, coming from no particular direction. We found the clearing just as the sun began its descent behind the peaks. It was exactly as Amanda had described from her research. A perfect circle of grass surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream running along the eastern edge. Too perfect, I realized later. Nature doesn't create perfect circles. Setting up camp took longer than it should have. Sarah's tent poles snapped in her hands, high-quality aluminum suddenly brittle as old bones. Michelle's sleeping bag had a long tear down the middle that hadn't been there during our gear check that morning. My water bottles, filled at the car, were empty, though I hadn't drunk from them. Amanda maintained her composure, sharing her equipment and organizing our campsite with military efficiency. But I saw her hands shake as she built the fire, and it took 6 tries to get the kindling to catch. When it finally lit, the flames burned an unsettling blue-green color for several seconds before settling into normal orange. "Copper in the wood," Amanda explained, but her eyes said she didn't believe it. Night fell with unnatural speed. One moment we had an hour of daylight left. The next, we were surrounded by absolute darkness. The fire seemed dimmer than it should be, casting shadows that moved independently of the flames. That's when we heard the whistling. It started as a low, musical sound coming from the forest, like someone playing a wooden flute badly. Sarah perked up, thinking it might be another camper, but the melody was wrong. Too irregular, with notes that hurt to hear. Michelle covered her ears and I felt my teeth ache. "Hello?" Sarah called out. "Is someone out there?" The whistling stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. No insects, no wind, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Even our fire had stopped crackling. "We should respond to Park Service if they're checking on campers," Sarah said, reaching for her flashlight. Amanda grabbed her wrist. "That wasn't human." The whistling resumed, but now it came from 3 different directions, as if a trio of invisible musicians had surrounded our camp. The melodies intertwined in harmonics that made my vision blur and my stomach clench with nausea. Michelle vomited into the bushes. When she wiped her mouth, there was blood on her lips. "I want to leave," she whispered. "Right now. I don't care if we hike in the dark." "We can't," Amanda said, consulting her compass. The needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction. "I don't know which way leads back to the trail." The whistling continued until nearly midnight, sometimes close enough that we could hear the sharp intake of breath between notes, sometimes so distant it might have been wind through stone. We huddled together by the fire, taking turns feeding it logs from our dwindling supply. Nobody slept. Around 3 a.m., Sarah had to pee. "I'm not going alone," she said. and Michelle agreed to accompany her to the edge of the clearing. They were gone for 20 minutes. When Michelle returned, she was alone. "Where's Sarah?" Amanda demanded. Michelle stood at the edge of the firelight, swaying slightly, her face blank. "She's coming. She found something interesting." "What kind of something?" "She'll show you." Michelle sat down heavily beside the fire, staring into the flames with unblinking eyes. I studied her face in the flickering light. Something was wrong. Subtly, horribly wrong. Michelle's features were the same, but the proportions seemed slightly off, like a photograph that had been stretched. Her smile stretched too wide, showing more teeth than should have been visible. "Michelle," I said carefully, "what did Sarah find?" She turned that unsettling smile toward me. "She found where the music comes from. She wants you to see, too. All of you." Amanda stood up, hand moving instinctively to the tactical knife on her belt. "Where exactly is Sarah?" "She's waiting by the trees. Can't you hear her calling?" I strained to listen, but heard only that oppressive silence. Amanda shook her head as well. Michelle's smile widened impossibly further. "She's calling your names. Jennifer, Amanda. Can't you hear how happy she sounds?" A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sarah had never used my full name. She'd called me Jenny since our first day at the firm 3 years ago. "Michelle," Amanda said slowly, "what's Sarah's boyfriend's name?" The thing wearing Michelle's face tilted its head with bird-like curiosity. "Boyfriend?" Sarah had spent 30 minutes that afternoon gushing about her new relationship, mentioning the man's name at least a dozen times. The real Michelle would have remembered instantly. Amanda's knife was in her hand now, the blade reflecting firelight. "Where's our friend? Where's the real Michelle?" The thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass wrapped in honey. "She's very close. Would you like to see her?" It stood up with fluid, inhuman grace, joints bending at angles that made my bones ache in sympathy. "She's right behind you." I spun around to see Michelle standing at the opposite edge of the clearing, the real Michelle. Her face contorted with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. She raised one trembling hand, pointing at the creature by our fire before stepping backward into the trees and disappearing. When I turned back, the false Michelle was gone. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Amanda had gone military, scanning the perimeter with professional intensity. "Skinwalker, maybe? Could be something else. Doesn't matter what we call it, we need to find our people and get out." "The GPS doesn't work. The compass is broken. How do we navigate in the dark?" "Same way soldiers did it for centuries. By the stars." She looked up and cursed. The sky was completely overcast. No moon or stars visible. We gathered our essential gear, water, first aid kit, Amanda's knife, my pepper spray. The fire would have to burn out naturally. We couldn't risk the time to extinguish it properly. Following Amanda's lead, we moved toward where I'd seen the real Michelle disappear. The forest was a maze of shadows and twisted branches that caught at our clothes and hair. Our flashlights created pools of light that seemed to make the darkness beyond even more impenetrable. We found Sarah's backpack first, abandoned beside a massive fallen pine. Her expensive North Face jacket was draped over a low branch, as if she'd deliberately left it for us to find. But there was something wrong with the jacket. It was shredded from the inside, as if something with claws had torn its way out. "Sarah," Amanda called softly, "where are you?" A rustling in the underbrush made us freeze. Something large was moving through the trees ahead of us, breaking branches and disturbing the thick carpet of fallen leaves. We followed the sound, flashlight beams dancing over pine needles and granite boulders. We found Michelle first. She was suspended 15 feet up in a Douglas fir, caught in the branches like a discarded puppet. Her eyes were open but empty, reflecting our flashlight beams like a nocturnal animal's. Her mouth moved soundlessly, as if she were trying to speak or scream. "Michelle," I called, "we're going to get you down." her head turned toward us with mechanical precision. When she spoke, her voice carried across the clearing with impossible clarity. "It's so beautiful up here. You can see everything. The music makes more sense when you're high enough. Michelle, we need to get you medical attention. Can you climb down?" She laughed, the same glass and honey sound we'd heard from her doppelganger. "I can see Sarah from here. She's teaching the music. Listen." The whistling resumed, but now I could tell it was coming from directly above us. Michelle's mouth wasn't moving, but the sound was emerging from her throat in pitch-perfect harmony with invisible musicians in the surrounding trees. Amanda grabbed my arm. "That's not Michelle anymore." "What do you mean that's not? Look at her legs." I aimed my flashlight upward and immediately wished I hadn't. Michelle's legs were bent backward at the knees, twisted at impossible angles to hook around the branches. No human joints could bend that way without breaking every bone. The thing that looked like Michelle waved at us with fingers that had too many joints. "Sarah wants to show you the music room. It's just a little deeper in the woods." We ran. Behind us, the whistling became a shriek of rage, joined by other voices, Sarah's voice and Michelle's real voice, and others I didn't recognize. The sound followed us through the trees, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes to our sides, herding us like wolves driving prey. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed fluid in that forest, moments stretching into hours, hours compressed into heartbeats. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and my legs shook with exhaustion, but stopping meant facing whatever was hunting us. Amanda led us through a gap between two massive boulders, and suddenly we were in another clearing. Not the perfect circle where we'd camped, but a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone walls, spirals and figures that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the amphitheater sat Sarah. She was perfectly still, cross-legged on a flat boulder, her back to us. Her hair moved in a breeze I couldn't feel, and she was humming. The same melody we'd been hearing all night, but somehow more complex, layered with harmonics that made my ears ring. "Sarah?" I whispered. She stopped humming. Slowly, she turned to face us. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion, like looking into deep water at night. Her smile was serene and terrible. "I've been waiting for you," she said in a voice that was hers but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "The music is so much more beautiful when there are more voices." Around the amphitheater's perimeter, figures emerged from behind the standing stones. Michelle was there. The real Michelle, I thought, until I saw another Michelle step out from a different shadow, and then another. Multiple Sarahs appeared as well, each slightly different, like variations on a theme. "Which one is real?" Amanda whispered, knife ready. "Does it matter?" Not Sarah said from her boulder. "We're all real. We're all here. We all want to sing with you." The duplicates began to close in, moving with that same fluid, inhuman grace. Their mouths opened in harmony, producing that soul-deep whistling that made my bones vibrate and my vision blur. Amanda grabbed my hand. "The petroglyphs. Look at the petroglyphs." I forced myself to focus on the ancient symbols carved into the rock. Most were abstract spirals and geometric patterns, but one section showed clearly recognizable figures. Humans being led by tall, elongated shapes with multiple arms toward what looked like a cave entrance. "It's a trap," Amanda said. "This whole place is a trap. How many people have disappeared here over the centuries?" The false Sarahs and Michelles were almost within arm's reach now, their harmonized whistling growing louder and more complex. I felt my own throat wanting to join in, my vocal cords vibrating with sympathetic resonance. "Don't listen," Amanda commanded, but her own voice was starting to harmonize with the others. I bit down hard on my tongue, using pain to break the musical compulsion. The taste of blood in my mouth seemed to clear my head, and suddenly I could see what the duplicates really were. They weren't perfect copies. They were approximations. like sketches drawn from fading memory. The creature or force inhabiting this place had absorbed Sarah and Michelle, learned their forms imperfectly, and was now trying to use them as bait. But the details were wrong. Sarah's birthmark was on the wrong side of her neck. Michelle's scar from childhood chickenpox was missing. "They're not our friends," I said, grabbing Amanda's arm. "They're echoes, shadows." Amanda shook her head as if waking from a dream. "Then where are the real ones?" A muffled sound came from beneath us, a pounding, like fists against stone. The flat boulder where the primary Sarah thing sat wasn't solid rock but a capstone covering a natural well or cave. "They're down there," I realized. "Still alive?" The false Sarah's black eyes widened with something like surprise. "Clever Jenny, but too late." She raised her hands, and every duplicate in the amphitheater began whistling in perfect unison. The sound was physically painful now, like needles being driven into my eardrums. I felt blood trickling from my nose. Amanda stumbled toward the boulder, knife raised, but 3 Michelle duplicates intercepted her. They moved like liquid, flowing around her strikes, their limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. I had to do something. Anything. I pulled out my pepper spray and emptied the entire canister in a wide arc around us. The duplicates recoiled with inhuman shrieks, their borrowed faces melting and reforming like wax in flame. Whatever they were, they retained enough human sensory memory to be affected by chemical irritants. "The boulder!" I yelled to Amanda. "Help me move it." Together, we threw our combined weight against the capstone. It was heavier than it looked, but desperation gave us strength. The stone shifted, revealing a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. From below came the sound of real voices. Sarah and Michelle, weak but alive, calling our names. "Go," Amanda said, fighting off a Sarah duplicate with her knife. "Get them out. I'll hold these things off. I'm not leaving you." "That's an order, soldier," she barked in her command voice. "Get our people and find a way out. I'll follow when I can." I dropped through the opening into absolute darkness. The chamber below was larger than I'd expected, a natural cave carved by centuries of water flow. My flashlight revealed smooth stone walls covered in more petroglyphs, these ones definitely depicting sacrifice and ceremony. Human figures were shown being lowered into the earth while elongated shapes danced around the opening above. Sarah and Michelle were chained to the far wall with what looked like old mining equipment. Heavy iron manacles connected to spikes driven deep into the rock. They were alive, but weak, their faces gaunt as if they'd been here for weeks instead of hours. "Time moves differently here," Sarah whispered when she saw my confusion. "We've been here for days, months, maybe. They keep us conscious, feeding on our fear." Michelle was barely coherent, mumbling about music and shadows. Her wrists were raw from struggling against the chains, and her eyes had the glazed look of someone pushed beyond their mental limits. I examined the manacles. The metal was old, but solid, locked with mechanisms I couldn't understand. But the spikes holding them to the wall were a different story. Centuries of moisture had weakened the rock around them. Using Amanda's spare knife from my pack, I began chipping away at the stone, working frantically as the sounds of combat continued above us. Amanda was still fighting, but I could hear her grunting with effort and pain. One of Sarah's manacles came free just as something dropped through the opening above us. It wasn't Amanda. The creature that landed in our prison was roughly humanoid but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in multiple directions and fingers that ended in black claws. Its face was a smooth expanse of pale skin with dark holes where features should be. "The music must continue," it said in a voice that was every voice and none at all. "The harmony requires 4 parts." It moved toward us with that same fluid grace I'd seen in the duplicates. I positioned myself between it and my friends, knife held in what I hoped was a threatening posture. The creature tilted its featureless head, studying me with senses I couldn't comprehend. "You taste of old grief, betrayal, abandonment, such rich flavors for the song." "Stay back," I warned, though my voice shook. I will wear your pain like jewelry, it continued, reaching toward me with those impossible fingers. Your friends will sing your sorrow forever. That's when Amanda dropped through the opening, landing hard but rolling to her feet with military precision. She was bleeding from multiple cuts, her clothes shredded, but her eyes burned with purpose. You want a song? She snarled at the creature. Here's one from the Marines. She pulled something from her pack, a flare, the kind used for emergency signaling. With a sharp motion, she struck the igniter and threw it directly at the creature's center mass. The thing screamed, not the musical harmony we'd been hearing, but a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass. Its form began to dissolve, flowing away from the burning flare like smoke in wind. Silver nitrate, Amanda explained tersely, already working on Michelle's remaining chains. Mountain rescue flares burn hot and bright. Old folklore says some things can't stand pure light. The creature reformed in the corner, smaller now but more solid, as if pain had forced it into a more concentrated form. You cannot leave. This place is mine. These songs are mine. Watch us, Amanda replied, freeing Michelle's second manacle. But when we looked up at the opening above us, it was gone. Solid stone stretched overhead where the gap had been moments before. Illusion, Amanda said, but she sounded less certain. Has to be. The creature laughed, a sound like wind through broken bones. Space bends here. Time flows backward. You entered through doors that no longer exist. I felt despair settling over me like a heavy blanket. We'd rescued Sarah and Michelle from their chains, but we were all trapped together now. The creature fed on fear and suffering, and we were giving it exactly what it wanted. There has to be another way out, Sarah said weakly. Caves have multiple entrances. Water flows have to go somewhere. I listened carefully and heard it, a faint sound of running water from deeper in the cave system. Following the sound, we discovered a narrow passage barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It leads up, Amanda reported after shining her flashlight into the tunnel. Might connect to the surface somewhere else. The creature watched us with its hollow features, making no move to stop our exploration. That should have been our warning. Why isn't it trying to stop us? Michelle whispered, her first coherent words since we'd found her. Because it knows something we don't, I realized. But what choice did we have? We entered the tunnel single file, Amanda leading, then Sarah, then Michelle, with me bringing up the rear. The creature followed at a distance, its form compressed to fit the narrow space but somehow still fundamentally wrong. The tunnel climbed steadily upward, branching and rejoining in a maze of natural passages. Our flashlights revealed more petroglyphs along the walls, but these were different, more recent, carved with modern tools. Names and dates going back over a century, memorials left by people who'd found this place and never left. 1892, 1903, 1924, Sarah read as we passed. All the missing persons reports from this area. The most recent date was from last month. We climbed for what felt like hours, following the sound of running water that always seemed to be just ahead of us. Our arms and knees were scraped raw from the rough rock, and the thin air made every breath a struggle. Finally, we saw light ahead. Real daylight, not the false illumination the creature had been showing us. The tunnel opened onto a narrow ledge on the mountain's eastern face, at least 1,000 feet above the tree line. The view was spectacular and terrifying. We could see for miles across the Sawatch Range, morning sunlight painting the peaks gold and orange, but we were trapped on a ledge barely wide enough for 2 people, with no visible way to climb either up or down. Dead end, Amanda said grimly. Behind us, the creature emerged from the tunnel, its form expanding back to full size now that it had room. The songs brought you here, as they bring everyone eventually. You cannot resist the harmony forever. It was right. I could feel the musical compulsion building again, my throat wanting to join the whistling that echoed from the stone around us. Sarah was already humming softly, her eyes glazing over. Fight it, Amanda commanded, but her own voice carried the beginnings of harmony. The creature smiled with a mouth that suddenly appeared in its smooth face, too wide, full of teeth like broken glass. Your pain will make the sweetest music. Betrayal and abandonment, fear and loss, all rendered in perfect pitch. It was talking about my divorce, about finding my husband with my sister, about the nightmares and shadows that had been haunting me for months. Somehow it knew about the therapy sessions, the medications that didn't work, the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. You're broken, it continued in a voice like poisoned honey. Damaged, worthless. Even your own family couldn't love you. What makes you think these friends are any different? The words hit harder than physical blows. These were the thoughts that kept me awake at night, the toxic voice in my head that no amount of therapy seemed to silence. Look how easily they were taken from you, how quickly they forgot you existed once the music started. You are alone, Jennifer Williams. You have always been alone. I felt myself starting to believe it, starting to let the harmony take hold. It would be easier to give in, to let the creature wear my pain like jewelry and sing my sorrow forever. But then I looked at my friends. Amanda was fighting the compulsion with military discipline, her jaw clenched with effort. Sarah was humming, but tears streamed down her face. She was aware of what was happening and horrified by her inability to stop it. Michelle was the weakest, barely conscious but still struggling against the mental invasion. They hadn't abandoned me. They'd come on this trip because they cared about my healing. They'd risk their lives to find me when I was taken. They were here, on this ledge, facing this creature because friendship meant something to them. The creature had shown me my fears, but it had also shown me the truth. I wasn't alone. You're wrong, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. They came for me. All of them. The harmony faltered slightly, and the creature's smile wavered. Amanda fought those duplicates to give me time to rescue Sarah and Michelle. Sarah figured out there had to be another exit. Michelle is fighting your control even now, after everything you've put her through. I stood up on the narrow ledge, facing the creature directly. I'm not alone. I'm not worthless, and I'm not going to let you use my pain to hurt my friends. The creature hissed, its form becoming less stable. Your defiance changes nothing. There is no escape from this place. Maybe not, I admitted, but there's something you don't understand about humans. I looked at Amanda, Sarah, and Michelle, my colleagues, my friends, my chosen family. We're stronger together than we are apart. I began to hum, not the creature's twisted harmony, but a song Sarah had been singing in the car on our way to the trailhead. A silly pop song about friendship and resilience. Amanda joined in, her military discipline redirected toward this act of defiance. Sarah and Michelle added their voices, weak but determined. The creature screamed, its form wavering like smoke in a hurricane. No, the harmony must be mine. The songs must serve me. But our song was different. It wasn't about fear or pain or loss. It was about connection, about choosing to stand together even when the odds seemed impossible. The ledge beneath us began to crack and crumble. The creature's rage was literally shaking the mountain apart. "Hold hands," Amanda shouted over the sound of splitting stone. "Whatever happens, we stay together." We linked arms just as the ledge gave way completely. I expected to fall, to plummet down the mountain face in a tangle of broken bodies. Instead, we found ourselves standing in bright sunlight beside our abandoned campfire, our packs exactly where we'd left them hours or days before. The creature was gone. The forest was full of normal sounds, birds, insects, wind through leaves. Our phones showed full battery and strong signal. "What just happened?" Michelle asked, her voice shaky but normal. "I think we broke the loop," Sarah said. "The music, the time distortion, the spatial displacement. It was all designed to keep us trapped in the creature's domain. But when we sang together, our own song, we changed the harmony," I finished, "made it about connection instead of isolation." Amanda was already breaking down our camp with military efficiency. We need to report this to the authorities. Other people could. Who would believe us? I asked. And what would we tell them? Don't camp near Mount Elbert because there's a creature that feeds on human suffering through musical compulsion? We packed in silence, each lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, I noticed that the trail markers were consistent now. The GPS worked perfectly, and time seemed to flow normally. At the car, we sat in exhausted silence for several minutes before Sarah finally spoke. "Are we going to talk about what happened back there?" "What's to talk about?" Amanda replied. "We went camping, had some equipment failures, decided to come back early. The creature? Bad dreams," Amanda said firmly. "Altitude sickness can cause hallucinations, mass hysteria. There are scientific explanations." Michelle and Sarah nodded, but I could see in their eyes the same knowledge I carried. We had encountered something ancient and hungry in those mountains, something that had been feeding on human fear for centuries. We had escaped not through strength or cleverness, but through the simple act of choosing each other over our individual terrors. The drive back to Denver was quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people avoiding a difficult topic. It was the peaceful quiet of people who had shared something profound and didn't need words to process it. When we reached the city, Amanda pulled into a 24-hour diner. "I don't know about you all, but I could use some normal food and bright lights." Over coffee and pancakes, we talked about work, about Sarah's boyfriend, about Michelle's photography hobby. Normal conversations about normal things. But there was an undercurrent of deeper connection now, a bond forged in that impossible place where music could trap souls and friendship could break ancient spells. I haven't had nightmares since that trip. The shadows in my peripheral vision have stopped moving. The whispers in empty rooms have gone silent. Whatever healing I was seeking in the wilderness, I found it. Not through solitude and nature meditation, but through the discovery that I wasn't as alone as I'd believed. My therapist says I seem more grounded, more connected to the present moment. I haven't told her about Mount Elbert, about the creature that fed on human suffering, about the chamber where time moved backward and space folded in on itself. Some experiences are too large for words, too important to risk diminishing through explanation. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night and hear music coming from no identifiable source, I hum that silly pop song Sarah was singing in the car. It works every time. The music fades, the shadows return to normal, and I remember that I chose connection over isolation once before. I can choose it again, as many times as necessary, because the most powerful magic isn't ancient curses or supernatural predators. It's the simple, everyday miracle of people who decide to stand together against the darkness, who choose to sing their own songs instead of letting others compose their harmony. And that's a magic that no creature, no matter how old or hungry, can ever take away. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 35 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Wolf Creek Pass in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, during what was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping trip with my German Shepherd, Rex. I had been planning this trip for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of my accounting job in Denver. The stress had been building for years, 60-hour weeks, demanding clients, and the constant pressure to meet impossible deadlines. My therapist, Dr. Morrison, had suggested I needed to reconnect with nature, to find some peace away from the digital world that had consumed my life. Rex, my faithful companion of 7 years, seemed as eager as I was to get away from the city's concrete maze. The drive to the trailhead near Wolf Creek Pass took 4 hours, winding through increasingly desolate mountain roads. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of early snow. I parked at the remote Treasure Falls trailhead, noting that mine was the only vehicle in the small gravel lot. The isolation felt perfect, exactly what I needed. Rex bounded from the truck, his black and tan coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, nose immediately to the ground as he investigated the new terrain. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. The weight of civilization seemed to lift as I shouldered my pack, heavy with 3 days' worth of supplies. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-marked path that followed Treasure Creek up into the high country. The plan was to hike about 6 miles to a remote alpine lake I'd found on my topographic maps, Lake Ute, tucked away in a cirque surrounded by 13,000-foot peaks. According to my research, few people ventured that far into the wilderness, especially this late in the season. For the first 2 hours, everything felt perfect. Rex trotted beside me, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents before returning to heel. The trail was clear, marked with the occasional blaze on a pine tree. The sound of rushing water accompanied us as we gained elevation, and the air grew thinner and colder. It was around 4 p.m. when I first noticed something off. Rex stopped abruptly, his ears pricked forward, staring into the dense stand of spruce trees to our left. His hackles rose, something I'd only seen him do twice before, both times when confronted with genuinely dangerous situations. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze. The forest was silent, completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no buzz of insects. Even the creek seemed muted. In 7 years of hiking with Rex, I'd learned to trust his instincts. If something had him on edge, I needed to pay attention. I stood motionless for several minutes, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound emerged from the shadows between the trees. Yet the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket, making my skin crawl. "Come on, Rex," I finally said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Let's keep moving." But Rex didn't move. He remained frozen, staring into those trees with an intensity that made my stomach clench. When I tugged gently on his collar, he whined, a sound I'd never heard him make before. It was high-pitched, almost desperate. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest depths. Rex bolted. He didn't run toward the sound. He ran away from it, racing up the trail with his tail tucked between his legs. I'd never seen him afraid of anything, and his terror was immediately contagious. Without thinking, I followed, jogging to catch up with him. We didn't stop running until we reached a small clearing about a mile further up the trail. Rex finally halted, panting heavily, but his posture remained alert and nervous. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath in the thin mountain air. "What the hell was that about?" I muttered, but Rex just whined again, looking back the way we'd come. I checked my GPS. We were still on track about 4 miles from Lake Ute. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the mountainside. I decided to push on. We could reach the lake before dark. Through, set up camp, and hopefully whatever had spooked Rex would be far behind us. The trail became steeper and more rocky as we climbed. The vegetation changed from dense forest to sparse alpine meadows dotted with stunted pines. The views were spectacular, jagged peaks stretching in every direction, painted golden by the setting sun. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Rex stayed close now, practically glued to my side. Every few minutes he would look back down the trail, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. I found myself doing the same, though I saw nothing but empty path disappearing into the growing shadows. We reached Lake Ute just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. The lake was everything I'd hoped for, a pristine alpine jewel nestled in a natural amphitheater of granite cliffs. The water was so clear I could see the rocky bottom even in the fading light. A small inlet creek tumbled down from the snowfields above, creating a gentle murmur that should have been soothing. But the silence was still wrong. No fish jumped in the lake. No marmots whistled from the surrounding rocks. Even the wind seemed muted. I set up my tent on a flat spot about 50 yards from the lake's edge, near a ring of stones that marked an old fire pit. Rex watched the entire process nervously, never straying more than a few feet from my side. When I started gathering firewood from the scattered deadfall around the campsite, He insisted on following me to each log, as if afraid to let me out of his sight. The sun had been down for an hour when I finally got a decent fire going. The flames danced cheerfully, casting a warm circle of light around our campsite, but beyond that circle the darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Thick clouds had rolled in, promising snow before morning. I heated up a can of chili on my camp stove and shared some jerky with Rex, but neither of us had much appetite. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, and Rex only nibbled at his portion before settling down beside the fire, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of our little island of light. It was then that I heard it. A voice, distant and indistinct, calling from somewhere across the lake. "Help! Help me!" I stood up so quickly I knocked over my camping chair. Rex was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Hello?" I called back, my voice echoing off the surrounding cliffs. "Where are you?" The response came from a different direction entirely, somewhere up the slope to our north. "Please, I'm hurt." It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. My first instinct was to help. Someone was injured out there in the wilderness, possibly dying. But Rex's growl deepened and he pressed against my legs, trembling. "Where are you?" I shouted again, grabbing my flashlight. "Keep talking so I can find you." "Help me, please. It hurts so much." This time the voice came from directly behind me, from the forest we'd emerged from hours earlier. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across the trees. Nothing. Rex was shaking violently now, his growl continuous and threatening. In the firelight, I could see the whites of his eyes, and his lips were pulled back to reveal his teeth. "This isn't right," I whispered to myself. No injured person could move that quickly across such difficult terrain, especially in complete darkness. And why would someone be out here alone, so far from any trail? "Please, Michael, help me." My blood turned to ice. The voice knew my name. I hadn't told anyone my name. There was no one else out here. No one even knew exactly where I was. I'd left my general plans with my neighbor but hadn't specified the exact location. "Michael, don't leave me." The voice was closer now, perhaps at the edge of the firelight, but I could see nothing beyond the dancing shadows cast by the flames. Rex suddenly erupted into a frenzy of barking, facing the darkness across the lake. His bark was different, not the warning bark I was used to, but something primal and desperate. The sound echoed off the cliffs, amplified and distorted until it seemed like a pack of wild dogs was surrounding us. Then the voice began to laugh. It started low and soft, almost musical, but quickly rose in pitch and volume until it became a shriek that made my ears ring. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, above us, behind us, from the depths of the lake itself. I grabbed Rex's collar and pulled him toward the tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. We scrambled inside together, and I zipped the entrance shut, knowing how flimsy the nylon walls would be against anything that truly wanted to get in. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the crackling of the dying fire outside and Rex's rapid breathing beside me. I sat in the darkness of the tent, one hand on Rex's head, the other gripping my hunting knife, the only weapon I'd brought. Minutes passed like hours. Rex gradually calmed down, though he remained alert, his ears tracking sounds I couldn't hear. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every small noise, the pop of a cooling log, the rustle of wind in the tent fly, the distant rumble of rockfall from the cliffs above. I was awakened from a deeper sleep by Rex's urgent whining. My watch showed 3:17 a.m. The fire outside had died to glowing embers, casting almost no light. Rex was pressed against the tent wall, staring at something outside. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling our campsite just beyond the ring of dead coals. But there was something wrong with the gait. Too long between steps, as if whatever was walking had legs much longer than a human's. I held my breath, trying to track the movement by sound alone. The steps paused directly outside the tent entrance, so close I could have reached through the thin nylon and touched whatever was standing there. Rex was trembling again, but he made no sound. His survival instincts had taken over completely. The tent wall next to my head suddenly bulged inward, as if something was pressing against it from outside. I could see the outline of what might have been fingers, but too long, with too many joints. The pressure increased until I was sure the fabric would tear. Then it stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving around to the back of the tent. Again, that impossible pressure against the wall, this time near my feet. I pulled my legs up instinctively, trying to make myself as small as possible. Michael. The voice was right outside now, barely a whisper but clear as crystal. "Come out, Michael. I need you to help me." It was still a woman's voice, but wrong somehow. The cadence was off, like someone trying to imitate human speech without quite understanding how it worked. "I'm so hungry, Michael. So very hungry." The pressure against the tent wall moved upward, tracing a path from bottom to top, as if something was feeling its way around our shelter. Rex pressed closer to me, his entire body rigid with fear. Hours passed. The thing outside continued its circuit of our tent, walking, pressing against the walls, whispering my name. Sometimes it would be silent for long stretches, and I would begin to hope it had left, only to hear those impossible footsteps resume. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, the sounds stopped. The oppressive presence that had surrounded us all night simply vanished, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and water. I waited until full daylight before unzipping the tent. Rex shot out ahead of me, immediately running to the lake's edge to drink deeply. He seemed like his old self again, confident and alert rather than terrified. The campsite looked completely normal. The fire ring was cold and gray, my camp chair still overturned where I'd knocked it over. My food supplies were untouched, hanging safely from the bear cable I'd rigged between two trees. But as I walked around the tent, I found them. Footprints in the soft earth. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the toe ends. The stride length was nearly 4 feet, far longer than any human could manage. The prints were deep, as if made by something much heavier than it appeared. The trail of prints circled our campsite exactly as I'd heard the footsteps do, but they didn't lead anywhere. They simply appeared at one point and vanished at another, as if whatever made them had materialized from thin air. I took pictures with my phone, though I doubted anyone would believe them. The rational part of my mind was already searching for explanations. Maybe a bear with an unusual gait, or elk tracks distorted by the soft ground. But I knew what I'd heard, and Rex's reaction had been unmistakable. I wanted to leave immediately, but something held me back. Pride, maybe, or stubborn disbelief. I'd planned this trip for months, and I wasn't going to let one night of strange sounds drive me back to the city. Besides, in daylight, surrounded by spectacular mountain scenery, the events of the night seemed almost dreamlike. I convinced myself it had been some kind of animal, maybe a mountain lion or bear that had wandered into camp, drawn by food smells. The voice had been auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and altitude. The footprints were just normal animal tracks distorted by shadows and fear. Rex seemed to have shaken off his terror as well. He spent the morning exploring the area around the lake, nose to the ground, tail wagging. Whatever had frightened him so badly was apparently gone. I decided to stay another night. The day passed peacefully. I hiked around the lake, taking pictures of the surrounding peaks. I caught and released several small trout, relieved to see that the lake wasn't as lifeless as it had seemed the night before. Rex chased ground squirrels and barked at marmots, behaving exactly like his normal self. As evening approached, I built up the fire higher than I had the previous night and set up my camp chair where I could keep my back to the lake and watch the forest. Rex settled down beside me, seemingly relaxed. But as the sun set and darkness crept across the mountains, that oppressive silence returned. The normal sounds of evening Night birds, insects, the rustle of small mammals simply didn't exist here. Even the wind seemed to die away completely. Rex noticed it too. His ears perked up and he moved closer to my chair. "It's okay, boy," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Whatever it was last night, it's gone now. But I was wrong. The voice started again around 10 p.m. "Michael, why didn't you help me?" This time it came from the lake itself, as if someone was treading water just beyond the reach of the firelight. "I waited for you all day, Michael. I waited and waited, but you never came." Rex was on his feet, growling low in his throat. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the lake. The beam penetrated the darkness, illuminating the calm water surface. Nothing was there. "I'm so hungry, Michael. You don't know what it's like to be this hungry." The voice was moving again, circling the campsite just as it had the night before. But now I could see something. Just at the edge of my vision, a pale shape moving through the trees. I stood up, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. "Who are you? What do you want?" The pale shape stopped moving. For a moment, everything was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then it stepped into the light. I immediately understood why Rex had been so terrified. It had once been human. That much was clear from the basic shape, but everything else was wrong. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung almost to its knees. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its fingers ended in black claws that looked more suited to a bird of prey than anything mammalian. But it was the face that made my knees buckle. The features were human, but distorted, as if someone had taken a photograph and stretched it vertically. The eyes were black holes in deep sockets, and the mouth was far too wide, filled with teeth that looked like broken glass. When it smiled, and it was smiling, I could see that its jaw unhinged like a snake's. "Hello, Michael," it said in that wrong woman's voice. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Rex erupted into a frenzy of barking, placing himself between me and the thing. His hackles were standing straight up, making him look twice his normal size. The creature tilted its head, studying Rex with interest. "What a lovely dog. He's been keeping you safe, hasn't he? But he can't help you now." It took a step closer, moving with a fluid grace that was nauseating to watch. Each movement seemed to involve too many joints, as if its bones were only suggestions rather than solid structures. "You know what I am, don't you, Michael? Deep down, in the part of your mind that still remembers the old stories?" I did know. My grandmother had told me the tales when I was young, stories of the Wendigo, creatures of endless hunger that had once been human until starvation and desperation drove them to cannibalism. They were supposed to be myths, legends told around campfires to frighten children. "I wasn't always like this," the Wendigo continued, still smiling that impossible smile. "Once I was like you. I had a name, a life, people who cared about me. But winter came early that year, and the snows trapped us in the high country. We ran out of food so quickly." It took another step closer, and I could smell it now. The sick, sweet stench of decay mixed with something else, something that made my stomach turn. "Do you know what it's like to be truly hungry, Michael? Not just missing a meal or two, but really, genuinely starving. When your body starts consuming itself, when you do anything, for just a taste of meat?" Rex was backing toward me now, his barking becoming more desperate. The Wendigo's attention fixed on him again. "He smells so good," it whispered. "Warm blood, fresh meat. It's been so long since I've eaten." That's when my paralysis broke. When it threatened Rex, some primal protective instinct overrode my terror. I lunged forward, slashing with the hunting knife. The blade passed through empty air. The Wendigo had moved faster than my eyes could follow, flowing around my attack like water. Its clawed hand caught my wrist, and the pain was immediate and excruciating. I felt bones crack under that inhuman grip. My scream echoed off the surrounding cliffs, and the knife dropped from nerveless fingers. Now. the Wendigo chided, its voice still that horrible mockery of feminine concern. "That wasn't very friendly. I'm just trying to have a conversation." It lifted me off the ground with that one hand, bringing my face level with its own. Up close, I could see that its skin wasn't just pale. It was translucent. I could see black veins pulsing underneath and deeper, something that might have been its heart, beating irregularly. "You're going to help me with my hunger problem, Michael. You and your dog both. But I want you to understand what's happening. I want you to know exactly what you're becoming." It released me, and I crashed to the ground, clutching my ruined wrist. Rex immediately placed himself between us again, but I could see he was trembling with fear. "The change doesn't happen all at once," the Wendigo continued, beginning to pace around the fire. "First, I'll eat your dog. You'll watch every bite, every crunch of bone, every swallow of flesh. The trauma will start to break your mind." Rex whimpered, as if he understood every word. "Then I'll start on you, but slowly. Oh, so slowly. A finger here, a toe there. I'll keep you alive as long as possible because fear seasons the meat so beautifully. And eventually, when the pain becomes too much, when your mind finally snaps completely, you'll beg me to finish it." The creature stopped pacing and fixed those black hole eyes on me. "But that's not when you'll change. The transformation happens when you take your first bite of human flesh, when hunger overrides humanity, when survival becomes more important than morality. That's when you become like me." It leaned closer, and I could see my reflection in its teeth. "I'm going to force-feed you pieces of yourself, Michael. And you'll swallow them, because the alternative is watching me do worse things to your dog. By morning, you'll be a Wendigo too, and your hunger will be just as endless as mine." I tried to run then, but my legs wouldn't work. The combination of pain from my shattered wrist and pure terror had left me barely capable of crawling. Rex stayed with me, licking my face, trying to comfort me even as his own fear made him shake like a leaf. The Wendigo laughed, that same shrieking sound I'd heard the night before, but this time I could see where it came from. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing a throat that seemed to descend forever into darkness. "There's nowhere to run up here, Michael. No one to hear you scream, no one to save you. Just you, me, and all the time in the world." It reached for Rex first. What happened next still plays in slow motion in my nightmares. The Wendigo's clawed hand descended toward my dog, those razor-sharp talons spread wide. Rex tried to dodge, but the creature was too fast. I heard the sound of claws piercing flesh, saw Rex's blood spray across the firelight. But Rex wasn't done fighting. 7 years of loyalty, 7 years of protection instincts, 7 years of loving a human being who fed him and scratched behind his ears and took him on hiking adventures. All of it crystallized into one moment of pure, focused aggression. Rex twisted in the Wendigo's grip and sank his teeth into the creature's wrist. His jaws locked with the pressure that German shepherds are famous for, the bite force that can crack bones. The Wendigo shrieked in genuine pain and surprise. Whatever supernatural transformation had created it, some part was still vulnerable to mundane damage. Black fluid spurted from the wound, smoking where it hit the ground. I forced myself to move. My knife was on the ground a few feet away, and I dove for it despite the agony in my broken wrist. The Wendigo was shaking its arm, trying to dislodge Rex, who was hanging on with desperate determination. I came up from my dive with the knife in my left hand, my good hand, and drove it up under the creature's ribcage. The blade went in easily, too easily, as if the Wendigo's flesh was rotten underneath that translucent skin. More of the black fluid poured out, along with a smell so foul it made me gag. But it wasn't enough. The Wendigo backhanded me across the face with its free hand, sending me flying into the cold ashes of the fire. I felt my cheek split open, tasted blood in my mouth. Rex was still attached to its other arm, growling and shaking his head like he was trying to tear a piece of flesh away. The Wendigo raised its hand high, preparing to smash my dog against the rocks. That's when I saw the axe. I'd brought a small camp hatchet for splitting firewood, and it was leaning against a log just within reach. I grabbed it and swung in one motion, putting every ounce of strength I had left into the blow. The axe blade caught the Wendigo at the base of the neck, where it connected to those impossibly wide shoulders. This time, the creature's scream was different. Weaker, more human. The blade had hit something vital. The Wendigo dropped Rex and staggered backward, both hands flying to its neck. Black fluid poured between its fingers, and I could see something pale and segmented writhing underneath the wound. Something that might have been a spine, or might have been something much worse. I swung again, this time at its leg. The axe blade bit deep, and the Wendigo toppled sideways, crashing into the lake with a splash that sent water cascading across our campsite. It tried to stand, thrashing in the shallows, but something was wrong with its coordination. The wounds I'd inflicted were healing. I could see the flesh knitting itself back together, but slowly, much more slowly than I'd expected. Rex appeared at my side, bloody but alive. 3 parallel gashes ran down his flank where the Wendigo's claws had caught him, but they didn't look fatal. He pressed against my legs, both of us watching the creature struggle in the water. "This isn't over," the Wendigo gasped, still in that horrible parody of a woman's voice. "You can't kill hunger, Michael. You can't kill need. I'll heal and I'll find you. Wherever you go, whatever you do, I'll be there, waiting." I watched it sink beneath the surface of the lake, black fluid spreading through the clear water like ink. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the water began to bubble and churn, as if something large was moving underneath. The surface erupted as the Wendigo's head broke through, but it looked different now. More decayed, more skeletal. Its eyes had become empty sockets, and when it opened its mouth to speak, only a gurgling sound emerged. It sank again, and this time it didn't resurface. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to come back, waiting for those clawed hands to emerge from the depths. But the lake gradually returned to its normal state, calm and mirror-smooth under the starlight. Rex and I spent the rest of the night huddled together by the revived fire, watching the water. Neither of us slept. Every ripple on the surface, every sound from the forest around us, sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. Dawn came eventually, as it always does. In the morning light, it was almost possible to believe that the whole thing had been a nightmare. Almost. But the blood on Rex's flank was real. The cuts on my face were real. My broken wrist, swollen to twice its normal size, was definitely real. And there, on the muddy shore of the lake, I could see the drag marks where something large had pulled itself into the water. We broke camp as quickly as my injuries allowed and hiked out without stopping. 6 miles had never felt so long. Every shadow in the forest could have been hiding a pale, skeletal figure. Every rustle in the underbrush could have been the sound of something following us. It took us 4 hours to reach the truck, and I've never been so grateful to see man-made metal and glass in my life. Rex jumped into the passenger seat and refused to get out, even when we stopped for gas and food on the drive back to Denver. I went to the emergency room as soon as we got back to the city. The doctor set my wrist and stitched up the cuts on my face, asking pointed questions about what kind of hiking accident could have caused such injuries. I told them I'd fallen down a rocky slope, which was close enough to the truth to be believable. Rex recovered much faster than I did, at least physically. The veterinarian said the claw marks would heal completely with time, but for weeks afterward, he would wake up in the middle of the night, whimpering and staring toward the mountains visible through our apartment window. I submitted my report to the Forest Service about potential dangerous wildlife in the area, though I kept the details deliberately vague. Within a month, they'd closed the trail to Lake Ute indefinitely, citing unstable geological conditions and wildlife management concerns. The official reason was that several hikers had reported feeling uneasy in the area, and one solo camper had been found at the trailhead in a state of severe psychological distress, claiming something had stalked him for 2 days before he managed to escape. I never went back to check if that something was still there, But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing down from the mountains, I think I can hear it calling my name. And Rex, sleeping at the foot of my bed, will suddenly lift his head and stare toward the window, his ears pricked forward, listening to something I can't quite hear. The Wendigo had said it would find me, wherever I went. I'm starting to think it meant that. Because last week, I found muddy footprints on my apartment balcony. Footprints that were too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the ends. They appeared overnight, 20 stories above the street, with no explanation for how they got there. The hunger is patient, the Wendigo had told me. And hunger, I'm learning, keeps its promises. I'm writing this account down because I need people to know what's out there, waiting in the wilderness. But I'm also writing it because I'm not sure how much longer I have. The footprints are appearing more frequently now, closer to my apartment door. Last night I could have sworn I heard breathing in the hallway outside. Rex knows something is coming. He hasn't slept properly in days, and he flinches every time a shadow moves across the window. Dogs always know first. If something happens to me, if I disappear, or if they find me in pieces, look for the truth in the closed trails, in the unexplained disappearances, in the stories that park rangers tell each other in whispers. The wilderness isn't empty. Some hungers are older than civilization, and they're still waiting in the dark places between the trees. The Wendigo was right about one thing. You can't kill hunger. You can only hope it finds someone else to feed on. But it's too late for hope now. I can hear footsteps in the hall outside my door, and they're getting closer. Rex is growling again. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October of last year in the remote wilderness near Rabbit Ears Pass in the Colorado Rockies, about 20 miles southeast of Steamboat Springs. I should have listened to the warnings from the locals in Kremling when I stopped for supplies. The old man at the hardware store, weathered and gray like the mountains themselves, had fixed me with a stare that seemed to see right through me when I mentioned my destination. Rabbit Ears Pass, you said? His voice carried the weight of too many winters. That's not a place for camping this time of year. Son, weather turns fast up there, and he'd paused, studying my face. Well, there's things in those woods that don't take kindly to visitors. I'd laughed it off then, chalking it up to small-town superstition. I was a software engineer from Denver, desperate to disconnect from the digital world that had consumed my life since my divorce 6 months earlier. Sarah had taken everything. Our house, our dog, our shared dreams. All I had left was my job and an overwhelming need to prove to myself that I could survive on my own, that I wasn't the helpless city dweller she'd accused me of being during our final, devastating argument. The drive up Highway 40 toward Rabbit Ears Pass had been beautiful in that stark, October way. Aspen trees dotted the mountainsides like scattered gold coins against the dark evergreens, and the air held that crisp promise of winter that made every breath feel clean and sharp. I'd found what looked like the perfect spot about 3 miles off the main road, following an old logging trail that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and spruce. The clearing I chose sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering trees, with a small creek running along its eastern edge. It was isolated, peaceful, and exactly what I thought I needed. I set up my tent just as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no screen could ever replicate. That first night passed uneventfully, though I did notice how absolutely silent the forest became once darkness fell. In the city, there's always noise, traffic, sirens, the hum of electricity. Here, the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against my eardrums until even my heartbeat sounded thunderous. I woke the second morning to find my campfire had somehow rekindled itself during the night. The ashes should have been cold, but orange flames danced merrily in the fire ring, consuming wood I didn't remember placing there. The logs were arranged in a perfect star pattern, something I'd never done in all my years of occasional camping. Standing there in my long underwear, morning breath clouding in the cold air, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some embers had lingered beneath the ash, catching on a stray piece of bark blown in by the wind. But even as I told myself this, I knew it didn't explain the deliberate arrangement of the burning logs. I spent that day hiking the surrounding area, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest like a cold stone. The forest was beautiful, but strangely empty. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no sign of the abundant wildlife that should have populated these mountains. Even the creek seemed muted, its usual babbling reduced to an almost whispered flow. It was while following a game trail up the ridge that I found the first sign I wasn't alone in these woods. Carved into the bark of a massive Douglas fir, about 8 feet off the ground, was a symbol I didn't recognize. A crude circle with radiating lines, like a child's drawing of the sun, but wrong somehow. The cuts were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds in the bark. I took a photo with my phone, though the image came out strangely distorted, the symbol appearing to shift and blur no matter how steady I held the camera. When I tried to call my friend Jake back in Denver to send him the picture, I discovered my phone had no signal, which was odd since I'd had 2 bars that morning. The temperature dropped rapidly as evening approached, and I found myself building up the fire earlier than usual, piling on more wood than necessary. Something about the encroaching darkness felt different here, more substantial. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the darkness itself was a living thing, patient and hungry. I was cooking a simple dinner of canned beans and hot dogs when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. A low, rhythmic thumping from the forest, like someone beating a drum with muffled hands. It came from the north, where the trees grew thickest, and continued for maybe 10 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept waking to small sounds, twigs snapping, what might have been footsteps circling my tent, and once, unmistakably, the sound of someone or something sniffing around the fabric walls. Each time I worked up the courage to peer outside, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. But the feeling of being watched never left, an itch between my shoulder blades that no amount of turning or shifting could relieve. The third morning brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. My hiking boots, which I'd left outside the tent as always, were gone. In their place were different boots, similar style and size but clearly not mine. These were older, more worn, and when I picked them up, they felt somehow warm, as if they'd recently been worn. I spent an hour searching the campsite, convinced this had to be some kind of elaborate prank. But who would hike this far into the wilderness just to mess with a lone camper? And how had they known my exact shoe size? The boots fit perfectly, which somehow made it worse. Wearing them felt like putting on a dead man's clothes, but I had no choice. The ground was too rough for socks alone, and my backup pair of sneakers had mysteriously vanished from my pack during the night. I decided to break camp that day and head back to civilization. Something was very wrong in these woods, and I'd proven enough to myself about surviving alone. But when I went to pack my tent, I found that all 4 guy lines had been cut, not torn or pulled loose, but sliced cleanly through with a sharp blade. That's when I saw the second symbol, this one carved into the ground itself, scraped deep into the earth just inches from where my head had rested all night. It was different from the tree carving, 3 interlocking circles with small marks radiating outward like rays or claws. My hands shook as I packed my gear, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. The silence of the forest had taken on a watchful quality, as if hundreds of unseen eyes were tracking my every movement. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing entirely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the hammering of my pulse in my ears. I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack when I heard my name being called from the forest. Michael. The voice was soft, almost feminine, carrying clearly through the still air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Michael Williams. Now it was closer, and I could hear something wrong with the pronunciation. Too precise, like someone reading from a script in a language they didn't quite understand. The way it lingered on the L sound made my skin crawl. I grabbed my pack and started toward the old logging road, not quite running, but moving as fast as I could manage with 40 pounds of gear on my back. Behind me, I could hear movement in the underbrush, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. Whatever was following me was trying to be quiet, but occasionally a branch would snap or leaves would rustle in a way that spoke of something large moving carefully through the trees. The logging road seemed farther away than I remembered, and I began to worry I'd gotten turned around in my haste to leave. Nothing looked familiar. The same lodgepole pines, the same granite outcroppings, the same patches of aspen that should have guided me back to my truck. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking, creating a maze where none had existed before. Michael Williams from Denver, Colorado. The voice was directly behind me now, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was speaking. I spun around, pack throwing me off balance, and found myself staring at empty forest. But the bushes were still swaying from recent passage, and I caught a glimpse of something pale disappearing between the trees, something that moved with a wrong sort of fluidity, like water flowing uphill. I ran then, all pretense of dignity abandoned. Branches tore at my jacket and scratched my face as I crashed through the underbrush following what I desperately hoped was the logging road. My pack bounced against my back with each step, the metal frame creaking in rhythm with my panicked breathing. The sound of pursuit was clearer now, not trying to hide anymore. Whatever was chasing me moved through the forest with impossible speed, crashing through obstacles that should have slowed it down. I could hear trees groaning and falling in its wake, as if it was simply bulldozing through anything in its path. I burst from the tree line onto what I thought was the logging road, only to find myself in another clearing I didn't recognize. This one was smaller than my campsite, circular with trees arranged around the perimeter in an almost perfect ring. In the center was a pile of stones, stacked in a careful spiral that hurt to look at directly. That's when I realized the chase had been hurting me, driving me toward this place like a wolf driving sheep toward a cliff. I was trapped in something far older and more deliberate than random wilderness danger. The voice spoke again, but this time it came from multiple directions at once, as if whatever was speaking had surrounded me. Michael Williams, age 34, divorced, no children, works for Data Flow Solutions in downtown Denver. Each fact about my life was delivered in that same too precise pronunciation, like a grocery list being read by something that didn't understand the meaning of the words. But the accuracy was what terrified me most. This thing knew details about my life that I'd never shared with anyone, details that couldn't be found in any public record. Movement flickered at the edge of my vision, and I caught my first clear look at what had been stalking me through the forest. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung nearly to the ground and fingers that seemed to have too many joints. Its skin was the color of birch bark, pale and marked with dark horizontal lines that might have been natural camouflage or ritual scarification. But it was the face that made me stumble backward, nearly falling over the stone pile. It wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, but somehow a horrible fusion of both. The features shifted and flowed like water, sometimes appearing almost normal, other times revealing glimpses of something predatory underneath. Too many teeth, eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal animal's, nostrils that flared too wide. Michael Williams, it said again, and I could see its mouth moving wrong, the lips not quite matching the sounds. You came to our place. You burned fire on our ground. You took our gift. I looked down at the boots I was wearing, the boots that had replaced mine, and understood with sick certainty that this wasn't the first camper to find their way to that clearing. The boots were old, well-worn, broken in by someone who was no longer in any position to need them. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I'll leave. I'll never come back. The thing tilted its head, studying me with those shifting, impossible eyes. Other shapes were moving in the forest around the clearing now, more of them, though I couldn't tell how many. They stayed in the shadows between the trees, but I could see the pale gleam of their bark-like skin and catch glimpses of those two long arms. "You burned fire on our ground," it repeated, and I realized it was stuck on this point, like a broken record. "The fire calls us. The fire feeds us. You fed us your fear, Michael Williams." It was then I understood that the mysteriously rekindled campfire hadn't been a warning. It had been a trap. These things, whatever they were, fed on fear the way normal predators fed on flesh. They'd been toying with me, building my terror gradually, savoring it like a fine wine. But understanding didn't help me escape. The creature stepped closer, and I could smell it now. Earth and decay and something else, something like ozone before a lightning strike. Its skin wasn't quite solid. I could see movement beneath it, as if things were crawling just under the surface. "Michael Williams," it said, and this time its voice was perfect, exactly matching my own. "Age 34, divorced, software engineer, scared little boy who couldn't even keep his wife happy." Sarah's words thrown back at me in my own voice by this impossible thing, the cruelest thing she'd said during our worst fights, accusations that had torn holes in my self-worth that still hadn't healed. Somehow, it knew, had plucked these memories from my mind while I slept. That's when I snapped. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just anger at this creature, but at Sarah, at my job, at the life that had crumbled around me, leaving me alone in these woods facing something that shouldn't exist. I was tired of being afraid, tired of running, tired of being the victim of circumstances beyond my control. I swung my pack off my shoulders and hurled it at the creature with all my strength. It connected solidly, and the thing stumbled backward with a sound like breaking branches. Whatever these entities were, they could be hurt. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran straight at the tree line where the shadows were thickest, hoping to break through their circle before they could react. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I crashed through the underbrush, but I could feel the familiar weight of real earth under the stolen boots, and for the first time in days, I knew which direction led back to my truck. Behind me, the forest erupted in sounds. Not just the creature I'd struck, but all of them, howling and crashing through the trees in pursuit. But their voices were different now, less controlled, more like the animal sounds they'd been imitating than human speech. The logging road appeared ahead of me like a miracle, and I could see my truck gleaming red through the trees. I had maybe 100 yards to cover, but I could hear them gaining behind me, their impossible speed eating up the distance. I reached the truck with seconds to spare, key already in my hand, and threw myself into the driver's seat just as pale figures burst from the tree line. The engine turned over on the first try, something that had never happened with this temperamental old Ford, and I floored the accelerator, spinning the wheels in the loose gravel as I fought to get moving. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the road, watching me go. They didn't give chase once I was in the truck, just stood there like pale sentinels until the trees hid them from view. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, not even for gas until I was well clear of the mountains. It wasn't until I was sitting in a brightly lit truck stop outside Golden that I realized I was still wearing the boots that had belonged to someone who hadn't made it out of those woods. I threw them in a dumpster behind the gas station and drove home in my socks. That was 8 months ago. I've tried to put it behind me, tried to convince myself it was stress-induced hallucination brought on by the divorce and isolation. I've even started dating again. A nice woman named Jennifer from work who thinks my camping stories are amusing rather than terrifying. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can hear my name being called in that too precise voice. And sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself responding to it, my lips moving to form words I don't remember deciding to speak. The boots are gone, but I think they left something behind when I wore them, Something that connects me to that place, to those things. Because every morning when I wake up, my apartment feels a little colder, and the shadows in the corners seem a little deeper. And yesterday, Jennifer mentioned that I'd been talking in my sleep, saying things she couldn't quite understand. Things that sounded like GPS coordinates for a place in the Colorado mountains, somewhere near Rabbit Ears Pass. I think they're calling me home. The worst part is that I'm starting to want to answer. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Rabbit Ears Pass, Colorado, during what was supposed to be a healing retreat with my two closest friends from college. The drive up Highway 40 should have been beautiful. The aspen trees were just beginning their autumn transformation, their leaves catching the late September light like scattered coins. But something felt wrong from the moment we left the main road and turned onto Forest Service Road 315. The GPS on my phone flickered, showing us in 3 different locations within the span of a minute before finally giving up entirely, displaying only a gray void where the map should be. Technology, laughed Jessica Davis, my best friend since freshman year, as she adjusted her hiking boots from the passenger seat. This is exactly why we needed this trip, Sarah. No phones, no internet, no distractions. Just us and nature. In the back seat, Michelle Young was already pulling out her expensive camera equipment, checking lenses with the methodical precision that had made her one of Denver's most sought-after wedding photographers. "The light up here is incredible," she murmured, not looking up from her camera. "I might actually get some decent landscape shots for once." I wanted to share their enthusiasm, but the narrow dirt road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. We hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and the isolation was starting to press against my chest like a weight. This trip had been my idea, a desperate attempt to reconnect with my friends after months of canceled plans and missed calls, after the divorce that had left me feeling like a stranger in my own life. The campsite I'd found online was described as primitive but peaceful, located near an unnamed lake in the Root National Forest. The photos had shown a pristine alpine setting, the kind of place where you could finally hear yourself think. What they hadn't shown was how the trees seemed to lean inward as we drove deeper into the forest, their branches creating a tunnel of shadows that our headlights barely penetrated despite it being only 4 in the afternoon. "Are you sure this is right?" Michelle asked, finally looking up from her camera as we bounced over another series of ruts that made my ancient Subaru groan in protest. "We've been driving for like 2 hours on this dirt road." I checked the handwritten directions I'd copied from the website, squinting at my own hurried scrawl. "Should be just another mile or 2. There's supposed to be a wooden sign marked Whispering Pines." Jessica twisted around to look at Michelle. "When's the last time you went camping? Like actual camping, not that glamping thing you did in Aspen." "Hey, that glamping trip was amazing. Climate-controlled tents and gourmet meals? That's my kind of roughing it." Michelle's laugh was forced, and I noticed she kept glancing out the windows at the increasingly dense forest. "But seriously, Sarah, this feels pretty remote. What if something happens?" "Nothing's going to happen," I said, though my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We're adults. We can handle 3 days in the woods." The sign, when we finally found it, was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the rustic but well-maintained marker I'd imagined, a weathered piece of plywood hung askew from a single nail on a dead pine tree. Whispering Pines had been carved into the wood with what looked like a knife, the letters deep and uneven, as if whoever made it had been angry or desperate. Below it, in fresher carving, someone had scratched, "Turn back." "Charming," Jessica said dryly as we turned onto an even narrower track that was barely more than 2 ruts separated by a strip of weeds. The campsite, when we reached it 15 minutes later, was both exactly what I'd hoped for and completely wrong. The clearing was larger than I'd expected, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines that must have been growing here since before Colorado was a state. A small lake stretched out beyond the trees, its surface so still it looked like black glass. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just the sound of our car doors slamming and our footsteps on ground that felt strangely soft, almost spongy. "Okay," Michelle said, hefting her backpack. "I'll admit it's beautiful, in a Stephen King kind of way." I busied myself unloading our gear, trying to shake off the unease that had been building since we left the highway. We were experienced campers, or at least we had been in college. Jessica had grown up spending summers in the Rockies with her family, and I'd done enough backpacking to know how to set up a camp efficiently. The familiar routine of unpacking tents and organizing supplies should have been comforting. Instead, everything felt off. The tent stakes went into the ground too easily, as if the earth beneath the pine needles was soft and wet despite the dry autumn weather. When I tried to start a fire in the established fire ring, the matches kept going out even though there wasn't any wind. The kindling was bone dry, but it refused to catch, as if something was actively working against me. "Here, let me try," Jessica said, taking the matches from my increasingly frustrated hands. She had better luck managing to get a small flame going, but even then the fire seemed reluctant, burning with an odd blue tinge around the edges that I'd never seen before. As the sun set behind the trees, much too quickly it seemed, we huddled around our strange fire and tried to recapture the easy camaraderie we'd shared in college. Michelle showed us photos from her latest wedding shoot, an elaborate affair in Vail that had taken 3 days to photograph. Jessica talked about her new job at a Denver law firm, how she was finally doing the kind of environmental law she'd always dreamed of. I tried to contribute, but there wasn't much to say about my post-divorce life of temp jobs and therapy appointments. "You know what?" Jessica said suddenly, looking at me across the flickering flames. "We should do this more often. Make it a tradition. Every fall, same weekend, just us 3. "If we survive this one," Michelle muttered, and something in her tone made me look at her more closely. She was staring out into the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight, her usually animated face tense and watchful. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Probably nothing. I just keep feeling like—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Like we're being watched. I know that's stupid, but I can't shake it." I wanted to dismiss her concern, but now that she'd said it, I felt it too. The weight of unseen eyes, the sense of something waiting just beyond the reach of our fire. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift and move, though I knew it was just my imagination. "It's just because we're not used to being so isolated," Jessica said, but she moved closer to the fire as she spoke. "No streetlights, no noise from traffic. It takes some getting used to." We turned in early, zipping ourselves into our respective tents as the temperature dropped and the darkness became absolute. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of my friends settling in for the night, and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. Just 3 friends camping in the woods, nothing more. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A twig snapping, footsteps that didn't quite match any animal I knew. A sound like whispered conversation from somewhere near the lake. I told myself it was just the forest settling, the normal sounds of a wild place at night. Then I heard Michelle scream. I was out of my tent and running toward the sound before I was fully awake, my bare feet slipping on the pine needles. Michelle's tent was empty, the front flap hanging open like a mouth. Her sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, still warm to the touch. "Michelle!" Jessica appeared beside me, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as her hands shook. "Michelle, where are you?" We called her name until our voices were hoarse, sweeping our flashlights across the campsite and into the trees. Nothing. No response, no sign of struggle, no indication of which direction she might have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished. "We have to call for help," Jessica said, fumbling for her phone. The screen lit up her face with an eerie blue glow, then went dark. No signal. Shit. "Sarah, we need to drive back to town, get the Rangers." "Wait." I grabbed her arm. Listen. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of our own panicked breathing, we could hear someone moving through the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps on fallen leaves, coming from the direction of the lake. "Michelle?" I called softly. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long moment, we heard her voice drifting through the trees. "I'm here. I'm okay." Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost collapsed. "Where are you? We couldn't find you." "By the lake. You have to see this, Sarah. It's beautiful." Something in her voice made me hesitate. Michelle was always enthusiastic about photography opportunities, but this was different. Flat. Emotionless. Like she was reading from a script. "Come back to camp," Jessica called. "It's too dark to be wandering around out there." "Come to the lake," Michelle repeated, and now I was sure something was wrong. The voice was coming from too many directions at once, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "You have to see." Jessica and I looked at each other in the flickering light of her phone's flashlight app. I could see my own fear reflected in her face. "We should go get her," I whispered. "No." Jessica's voice was firm. "Something's not right. Michelle would never wander off like that in the middle of the night. And that voice..." She shuddered. "That doesn't sound like her." We stood there in the darkness, listening to the sound of footsteps circling our camp just beyond the range of our flashlights. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the lake, sometimes from deeper in the forest. And always, every few minutes, Michelle's voice calling to us, "Come to the lake, it's beautiful here." But it wasn't Michelle. I was becoming more certain of that with each repetition. The cadence was wrong, the inflection too perfect, like a recording played back without the natural variations of human speech. "We're leaving," I said finally. "Now. Pack what you can carry, leave the tents. We'll come back with help in the morning." It took us 10 minutes to throw our essential gear into our backpacks. The whole time we could hear the footsteps circling closer, and Michelle's voice calling out with increasing frequency and intensity. By the time we reached my car, she seemed to be speaking from directly behind us, though every time we turned around, nothing was there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal, whispering prayers to whatever deity might be listening in this God-forsaken place. "Sarah." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "Look." At the edge of our headlight beams, something was moving between the trees. At first I thought it was Michelle, but as my eyes adjusted I realized the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving with a strange, jerky gait that reminded me of a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. The engine finally caught, and I gunned it, spinning the wheels in the soft dirt as we lurched forward onto the narrow track that led back to the main road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the thing at the edge of our campsite. It was watching us go with eyes that reflected the taillights like an animal's, but its face was human, female, familiar. It was Michelle, but not Michelle. The drive down the mountain was a nightmare of hairpin turns and washboard ruts that threw us around the car's interior like dice in a cup. I kept the accelerator pressed to the floor, not caring if we went off the road as long as we got away from whatever we'd left behind at the lake. We didn't speak until we reached the main highway, where the blessed sight of other cars and electric lights made the world seem normal again. Only then did Jessica break the silence that had stretched between us like a taut wire. What was that thing? I didn't have an answer, couldn't have one, because admitting what I thought I'd seen would mean accepting that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. We drove straight to the Routt County Sheriff's Office in Steamboat Springs, where we spent the next 4 hours giving statements to a deputy who clearly thought we were either lying or hysterical. A search and rescue team was dispatched at first light, but they found nothing. No sign of Michelle, no indication of any struggle, no trace that we'd even been there except for the cold ashes of our fire. The official report listed Michelle Young as a missing person, presumed lost in the wilderness. Her body was never found, despite extensive searches that continued for weeks. Eventually, the case went cold, filed away with all the other unexplained disappearances that happen in Colorado's vast wilderness areas every year. Jessica and I never talked about what really happened that night. We couldn't. How do you explain that your friend was taken by something that wore her face and spoke with her voice? How do you make sense of a place where the very trees seemed malevolent, where darkness had weight and substance? But 6 months later, I got a letter with no return address postmarked from Steamboat Springs. Inside was a single photograph, one of Michelle's professional landscape shots, perfectly composed and expertly lit. It showed the lake at our campsite, its surface reflecting the early morning sky like a mirror. In the foreground, barely visible among the reeds at the water's edge, was a figure. Too tall, too thin, with eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. At me. On the back, in Michelle's careful handwriting, someone had written, "Come back to the lake. It's beautiful here." I burned the photograph, but I kept the ashes. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I take them out and hold them in my palm, feeling their weight like a secret I can never share. Because part of me, the part that still wakes up screaming Michelle's name, knows that someday I'll have to go back. The thing that took my friend is still out there, waiting by that nameless lake in the shadow of Rabbit Ears Pass, and it's not done with us yet. It has Michelle's memories now, her voice, her face. It knows everything she knew about Jessica and me, about our lives and our fears and our secrets. Most nights, I can ignore the pull I feel toward that place, the whispered invitation that echoes in my dreams. But it's getting stronger, more insistent, more. And I'm starting to understand why Michelle walked out of her tent that night, why she went willingly to the lake despite every instinct that should have kept her in the safety of our camp. Because it calls to you. It knows exactly what you need to hear, exactly how to make you believe that everything will be beautiful if you just come a little closer, just step into the darkness where it's waiting with arms that are too long and a smile that's too wide and eyes like black water that reflect nothing at all. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened to Michelle Young in the wilderness near Rabbit Ears Pass. I need someone to understand that when they find this account, and they will find it, because I can feel the pull getting stronger every day. I didn't go willingly. I fought it as long as I could. But some things are stronger than fear, stronger than the survival instinct, stronger than the bonds that tie us to the world of light and warmth and human companionship. Some things reach across the void between what is and what should never be, and when they call your name, you answer. The lake is beautiful after all. Michelle was right about that. She's been right about everything. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in October of last year, when the aspen leaves had turned that brilliant gold that draws tourists from across the country to Colorado's high country. I should have known better than to venture into the backcountry alone near Rabbit Ears Pass, especially so late in the season when the first snows could trap you for weeks. But after my divorce was finalized, I needed solitude more than I needed safety. I'm a wilderness photographer by trade, and I'd been planning this trip to capture the last autumn colors in the Root National Forest for months. The area around Rabbit Ears Pass, with its distinctive twin peaks that look like enormous rabbit ears against the sky, had always fascinated me. Local Ute legends spoke of spirits that dwelled in those peaks, watching over travelers. I found comfort in that idea, the notion of benevolent watchers in the wilderness. My destination was a remote alpine lake called Mirror Tarn, accessible only by a barely maintained trail that wound through dense stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The trailhead sat at nearly 10,000 feet elevation, and the lake itself rested in a cirque at almost 11,500 feet. It would be cold, possibly below freezing at night, but my gear was rated for much worse conditions. I'd packed my usual setup, a sturdy 4-season tent, sleeping bag rated to 20 to 4. portable stove, enough food for 5 days, and, of course, my camera equipment. The weather forecast called for clear skies for the first 3 days, with a possible storm system moving in later in the week. Plenty of time to get the shots I wanted and hike back out. The drive up Highway 40 toward Rabbit Ears Pass took me through increasingly remote country. Past Steamboat Springs, the traffic thinned to almost nothing. The road climbed steadily through golden aspen groves that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. By the time I reached the unmarked dirt road that led to the trailhead, I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The parking area was nothing more than a widened spot in the road, barely large enough for 3 vehicles. Mine was the only car there. I shouldered my 45-pound pack and studied the trail map one last time. The route was straightforward enough. Follow the creek drainage up through the forest, cross 2 avalanche chutes, then climb the final steep section to the lake. 8 miles total, with about 1,500 feet of elevation gain. I estimated it would take me 5 hours with my heavy pack and frequent stops for photographs. The trail began pleasantly enough, winding through a corridor of towering spruces whose branches formed a cathedral ceiling overhead. Shafts of golden afternoon light slanted through the canopy, illuminating patches of kinnikinick and mountain ash. The familiar weight of my pack and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the needle-strewn trail gradually eased the tension I'd been carrying for months. But as I climbed higher, subtle things began to feel wrong. The forest was too quiet. In all my years of backcountry hiking, I'd never experienced such complete silence. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush, no chittering of pikas or marmots. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees themselves absorbed all sound. I tried to dismiss the unease as leftover anxiety from my recent life upheaval. The divorce had left me hypervigilant, jumping at shadows. But the silence persisted, growing more oppressive with each mile. When I stopped to drink water and adjust my pack straps, I found myself listening intently for any sign of life. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the distant murmur of the creek. The first avalanche chute offered a welcome break from the claustrophobic forest. The open slope, littered with broken trees and car-sized boulders, stretched several hundred yards upward toward the tree line. As I picked my way carefully across the unstable terrain, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a figure standing motionless among the trees on the far side of the chute. I stopped and pulled out my binoculars, focusing on the spot where I'd seen the movement. Nothing. Just the vertical lines of tree trunks creating optical illusions in the fading light. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk, though the shape had seemed distinctly human. And it had been completely still, which struck me as odd for wildlife. By the time I crossed the second avalanche chute, dusk was settling over the mountains. The temperature was dropping fast and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the thin air. I still had 2 miles to go, but the trail ahead disappeared into darkness between the trees. I would have to use my headlamp for the final push to the lake. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, like someone calling my name from a great distance. I spun around, my headlamp beam sweeping across the empty trail. The light seemed to die just a few feet into the darkness, absorbed by the thick forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and small in the vast silence. No response. Just that oppressive quiet settling over me like a burial shroud. I continued climbing, but now every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. The whispers came more frequently, always from behind, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes they sounded like my name. Other times they were wordless murmurs that raised the hair on my arms despite my heavy jacket. When I finally reached Mir Tarn, nearly 2 hours after dark, I was exhausted and on edge. The lake was a perfect black circle surrounded by towering granite walls that rose into invisible heights above my headlamp beam. I found a flat spot about 50 yards from the water's edge and began setting up camp, grateful for the familiar routine of unpacking gear and assembling my tent. But even as I worked, I felt watched. Multiple times I spun around, expecting to find someone standing at the edge of my light. The sensation was so strong I could pinpoint the direction, always from across the lake, somewhere in the impenetrable darkness beyond the opposite shore. I forced myself to eat a quick dinner of freeze-dried pasta, though my appetite had vanished entirely. The whispers had stopped once I reached the lake, but the silence felt even more threatening than the phantom voices. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That first night, I barely slept. Every small sound, the settling of my tent fabric, the distant crack of cooling rock, sent adrenaline shooting through my system. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps circling my campsite, slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the frost-stiffened grass. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe until the sounds faded away. When I finally dozed near dawn, I had vivid nightmares about drowning in the black lake while pale faces watched from beneath the surface, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly as if they were trying to tell me something important. I woke to brilliant sunshine and felt foolish about my night terrors. The lake was a stunning sapphire blue, reflecting the granite peaks that surrounded it like ancient sentinels. This was exactly the kind of pristine wilderness scene I'd come to photograph. I spent the morning capturing images of the tarn from every angle, working my way around the shoreline with tripod and telephoto lens. It was while I was photographing the far shore that I noticed the tracks. They led from the water's edge up into the rocks, and they were unmistakably human. Bare feet by the look of them, with unusually long toes. The impressions were deep in the muddy bank, as if made by someone much heavier than their foot size would suggest. They disappeared on the granite, but I could see where they emerged again higher up the slope, heading toward a cluster of house-sized boulders. I told myself they belonged to another hiker, though I couldn't imagine anyone walking barefoot at this elevation and temperature. The lake was at nearly 11,500 feet. Even in summer, the water temperature rarely rose above 45 degrees. In October, it would be close to freezing. But the rational explanation comforted me, and I spent the rest of the day in a much better mood. I captured some truly spectacular shots as the afternoon light painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold. By evening, I was feeling confident about the trip. One more day of photography, then I'd hike out and be back home by the weekend. That confidence evaporated when I woke the second night to find someone standing beside my tent. The figure was perfectly silhouetted against the star-filled sky, motionless and tall. Too tall, I realized with growing horror. At least 7 feet, with arms that seemed to hang below its knees. I could see it clearly through the mesh inner wall of my tent, but my night vision wasn't good enough to make out details. Just the outline of something that was almost, but not quite, human. I lay frozen, not even daring to reach for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. The thing stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, without sound or movement that I could perceive, it was gone. One moment it was there. The next, I was staring at empty sky. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, I examined the ground around my tent with obsessive care. I found the same barefoot tracks, this time in a complete circle around my campsite. The impressions were deeper now, as if whatever made them had been carrying something heavy, or as if it had grown more substantial overnight. My hands shook as I packed my camera gear. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should leave immediately, hike back to my car, and never return to this place. But I'm stubborn by nature, and I'd invested too much time and effort in this trip to be scared off by what was probably just an extremely unusual fellow hiker. I decided to stay one more night, but I would be prepared. I had a small canister of bear spray in my pack, and I moved it to an easily accessible pocket. I also set up my camera on a tripod with a motion sensor, aimed at the spot where the figure had stood. If something visited my campsite again, at least I'd have proof. The third day passed uneventfully. I hiked up to the cirque's head wall and captured some stunning images of a small waterfall that fed the lake. The exercise and familiar routine of photography helped calm my nerves. By evening, I was almost convinced I'd imagined the nocturnal visitor. But as I settled into my sleeping bag after a dinner of instant rice and canned chicken, the whispers started again. This time they were louder, more distinct, and definitely saying my name. Jennifer, Jennifer. Over and over, in a voice that sounded like wind through hollow reeds. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the entire cirque was calling to me. I unzipped my tent fly and peered out into the darkness. My headlamp beam revealed nothing but empty shoreline and the black mirror of the lake, but the whispers continued, growing more insistent. Jennifer. Come to the water, Jennifer. The voice was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache with longing. It reminded me of my grandmother's lullabies, of summer evenings from childhood when the world felt safe and full of wonder. Despite every survival instinct screaming warnings, I found myself unzipping my sleeping bag. The night air hit me like a physical blow, but I barely felt the cold. Something was drawing me toward the lake with an irresistible pull. I stepped out of my tent wearing only thermal underwear and wool socks, my feet immediately going numb in the frost-covered grass. Jennifer, we've been waiting so long. The voice was clearer now, and I could see where it was coming from. The lake surface was perfectly still, but in its center stood a woman. She appeared to be standing on the water itself, her pale skin glowing with soft phosphorescence. Her hair fell to her waist in dark waves, and when she smiled, her teeth gleamed like pearls. "Who are you?" I called out, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "I am what you've been searching for," she replied. "The solitude you crave, the peace you need. Come into the water with me, Jennifer. Let me show you what lies beneath." I took a step toward the shoreline, then another. The mud squelched between my toes, shockingly cold but somehow not unpleasant. The woman on the water extended her arms toward me in welcome. "That's right, just a little further. The water is warm once you're beneath the surface. Warm and quiet and safe." I was waist-deep when the first fragments of clarity broke through the enchantment. The water was so cold it felt like liquid fire against my skin. My legs were already going numb, and I could feel my core temperature plummeting. This was how people died in alpine lakes. Hypothermia could kill in minutes in water this cold. But when I tried to turn back toward shore, I found I couldn't move my legs. Something had wrapped around my ankles beneath the black water. Something that felt like rope or vine, but with a texture that was disturbingly organic. "Don't fight it," the woman said, and her voice had changed. It was still beautiful, but now I could hear the hollow reed quality more clearly, like air passing through a corpse's throat. Fighting only makes it harder. I looked down into the water and saw other faces looking back at me. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all floating just beneath the surface with their eyes open and their mouths moving soundlessly. They were pale and bloated, their skin bearing the waxy sheen of bodies that had been underwater for a very long time. The thing around my ankles tightened and pulled. I went under. The cold was indescribable. It felt like every nerve in my body was being stabbed with ice picks. But worse than the cold was the realization that I could see clearly underwater, and what I saw made me want to scream until my lungs burst. The lake wasn't deep, maybe 30 feet to the bottom, but every inch of the bottom was carpeted with human bones. Skulls and rib cages and femurs, all bleached white and perfectly preserved in the frigid water. Some still had scraps of fabric clinging to them, modern clothing mixed with what looked like much older garments. And moving among the bones were things that had once been human, but were human no longer. They swam with fluid, inhuman grace, their limbs elongated and their fingers ending in black claws. Their faces retained just enough human features to be recognizable as such, but their eyes had become solid black orbs and their mouths were filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The woman who had called to me from the surface was swimming toward me now, and I could see she was the same as the others. Her beautiful face was a mask stretched over something predatory and ancient. The phosphorescent glow came from patches of bioluminescent decay scattered across her skin. "Welcome home," she said, and her voice carried perfectly through the water. "We've been so lonely." The things that had once been human surrounded me, their hands reaching out to stroke my hair and face with a tenderness that was more terrifying than any violence could have been. I tried to struggle, but the cold had stolen all strength from my muscles. I could feel my heart slowing, my thoughts becoming sluggish and disconnected. This was how I would die. Not from drowning, but from the cold. My body would sink to join the carpet of bones, and eventually I would become like these creatures, luring other lost souls into the black water. But as consciousness began to fade, something sharp pressed against my ribs. The bear spray canister in my thermal shirt pocket. With the last of my strength, I managed to pull it free and spray it directly into the face of the woman thing. The effect was immediate and devastating. She shrieked, a sound like tearing metal that carried through the water and up into the air above. The other creatures recoiled, their perfect faces contorting with pain and rage. The grip on my ankles loosened. I kicked desperately for the surface, my lungs burning with the need for air. When I broke through, gasping and choking, I could hear inhuman screams of fury rising from the depths behind me. The water around me began to churn and bubble as if it were boiling. I swam for shore with a speed born of pure terror, my body moving on adrenaline and survival instinct alone. When I reached the muddy bank, I hauled myself out and ran for my campsite, not caring about the rocks cutting my feet or the branches tearing at my skin. My tent had been shredded. Long parallel gashes ran through the fabric, and my gear was scattered across a wide area as if thrown by tremendous force. But my car keys were still in the pocket of my jeans, and that was all that mattered. I grabbed what clothes I could find and ran for the trail, not bothering to put them on until I was well away from the lake. Behind me, the screaming continued, joined now by other voices, human voices calling my name, pleading with me to come back, promising forgiveness and peace and an end to all pain. I ran through the darkness, stumbling and falling repeatedly on the rough trail, guided only by my headlamp beam. Branches whipped at my face, and more than once I took wrong turns that led me into deadfalls and thickets. But the voices followed me, always just behind, always calling. It took me 6 hours to reach my car. By then, dawn was breaking over the mountains and the voices had finally faded to whispers, then to silence. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way. I never reported what happened at Mir Tarn. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I researched the area's history and found disturbing patterns. Over the past century, dozens of hikers had vanished in the Rabbit Ears Pass area. Their bodies were never found, and search efforts always focused downstream, assuming they had fallen into fast-moving water and been swept away. But I knew where they were. They were at the bottom of Mir Tarn, their bones adding to the ancient collection, their souls transformed into something hungry and patient and eternally waiting. I also found references to the lake in Ute oral traditions. They called it the place where spirits drink, and considered it taboo to camp near its shores. According to legend, it was a portal to the underwater realm where the souls of the drowned gathered to sing travelers to their deaths. The Ute were wise to stay away. 3 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was my camera, the one I'd left on the tripod that last night. The motion sensor had triggered exactly once at 3:17 a.m. The image showed my tent with perfect clarity, but in the foreground, partially blocking the lens, was a pale hand with impossibly long fingers. Attached to the camera was a note written in spidery handwriting. "Your pictures turned out beautifully. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Your friends at Mir Tarn." I threw the camera away, but I kept the note. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear whispers calling my name. They're getting louder, and lately I've been thinking about how peaceful that black water looked. and how the cold wasn't really that bad once you got used to it. How all those faces floating beneath the surface seemed so content, so free from the burdens of life above. Maybe I should go back, just to take a few more pictures, just to see if they're still waiting. Maybe I will.